For 3 years, I sacrificed my career and my savings and my sleep to care for our dying parents while my brother never even visited. After the funeral, he sued me for the family trust to leave me with absolutely nothing until the judge opened our parents' final letter and revealed exactly why my brother's name had been completely erased. My name is Clara. I am 34 years old. I used to be a tenured high school history teacher. I loved my job. I loved my students. But today, I am a freelance copywriter standing in the fellowship hall of my parents' Presbyterian church in Ohio. I am wearing a plain black morning dress that feels entirely too heavy for my body. My bones ache with a kind of physical and emotional exhaustion that sleep simply cannot fix. I have just buried my mother and my father within exactly 1 month of each other. The room smells of stale coffee and egg salad sandwiches and strong funeral lilies. It is a suffocating combination. People I have known my entire life are walking up to me and patting my shoulder and offering soft murmurs of sympathy. I smile and I nod, but I am barely holding myself together. My mind is a blur of medical bills and hospice nurses and the terrible silence of an empty house. I have spent the last 36 months keeping 2 people alive, and now that they are gone, I do not know what to do with my hands. I was standing by the sandwich tray, trying to force down a glass of tap water, when the heavy wooden doors of the fellowship hall swung open. A man walked in. He did not look like he belonged at a funeral reception. He was wearing a cheap gray suit that was wrinkled at the elbows, and he was holding a very thick manila envelope. He scanned the room, and his eyes darted past the grieving relatives and the church elders. Then he locked eyes with me. He walked straight up to the sandwich tray. He did not lower his voice. He did not show an ounce of respect for the setting or the situation or the fact that I was standing in front of a memorial display of my parents. He asked if I was Clara Hayes, and his voice cut through the soft conversations of the room like a knife. I nodded slowly and lowered my plastic cup. I told him, yes, I am Clara. He said loudly that I had been served. He shoved the thick manila envelope against my chest and forced me to take it with both hands. Then, he simply turned around and walked right out to the door without another word. The church fellowship hall went completely silent. 50 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me. I stood frozen in place. The heavy envelope felt warm in my calloused hands. I looked down at the label pasted to the front of the package. The words were printed in stark black ink. It was a formal civil lawsuit. The charges listed directly beneath my name were elder abuse and fraud and asset manipulation. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard, I thought my chest might break. I could not breathe. The air in the room felt too thin. I looked for the name of the plaintiff because I expected it to be a massive mistake. I thought it must be a bank error or a hospital billing issue or some terrible misunderstanding with the state. But the name printed clearly on the top line belonged to the man who was standing directly across the room from me. The plaintiff was my brother, Greg. Greg is 38 years old. He was standing near the silver coffee urn in a perfectly tailored black designer suit. His hair was perfectly styled with expensive product. He was holding a styrofoam cup of coffee and accepting condolences from the church pastor with a look of profound and performative sorrow on his face. He was playing the perfect grieving son for the crowd. But as I stood there holding the lawsuit he had just filed against me, Greg looked over the pastor's shoulder and he met my eyes. He did not look sad at all. He looked incredibly smug. He looked like a man who had just won a game nobody else knew they were playing. I looked down at my own hands holding the envelope. My hands are rough and calloused and dry. They do not look like the hands of a 34-year-old woman who sits at a desk. They look like the hands of a full-time medical nurse. And for the past 3 years, that is exactly what I have been. The memories rushed back and hit me harder than the shock of the lawsuit itself. I remembered the exact afternoon 3 years ago when everything changed. I was sitting in my classroom grading history papers when the doctor called to tell me my father was diagnosed with rapid onset dementia, and my mother was experiencing severe heart failure. They could no longer live alone. They needed round-the-clock care. I called Greg in an absolute panic. I asked him how we were going to handle this crisis together as a family. Greg lived in Scottsdale, Arizona. He ran what he proudly called a highly successful investment firm. I will never forget the cold tone of his voice on that phone call. He sounded incredibly annoyed that I had even bothered to interrupt his day. He told me he was building an empire out there in the desert. He said he was entirely too vital to his investment firm to pack up and move back to a boring suburb in Ohio. He reminded me that I was just a high school history teacher and that my job was easily replaceable, but his job was changing the world. He told me I needed to step up and handle the situation because family comes first. So I did exactly what he demanded. I stepped up. I walked into my principal's office the very next morning, and I resigned from my tenured teaching position. I sacrificed my career and my retirement pension and my entire financial stability. I moved back into our childhood home, and I became a ghost. For 3 long years, I bathed our parents. I managed my father's complex insulin schedule and his heavy dementia medications. I held my mother's fragile hand through multiple terrifying hospital visits in the middle of the night. I stayed awake for days at a time and survived on cheap instant coffee and sheer willpower while I watched the 2 people who raised me slowly fade away into shadows of themselves. I learned how to operate oxygen tanks and how to calm my father down when he forgot who I was and threw things at me. I gave up my entire social life and my youth to keep them comfortable and safe in their own home. And in all those 3 years, Greg never visited us. Not a single time. Whenever I begged him to come see them before it was too late, he claimed he was simply too busy managing important financial portfolios. He sent cheap generic flower arrangements on their birthdays that wilted in 3 days. He called for exactly 5 minutes on Christmas morning and spent 4 of those minutes talking about his new sports car. He never sent a single dollar to help with the mounting medical bills. I paid for the home healthcare aides and the mobility ramps and the expensive oxygen tanks completely out of my own depleted savings account. I drained every penny I had ever saved just to keep our parents breathing. Now standing in the church fellowship hall, the absolute cruelty of the situation crashed over me like a freezing ocean wave. I had just spent 3 years keeping our parents alive while Greg completely ignored their existence. And the very second they were in the ground, he had hired a process server to ambush me at their wake with a lawsuit accusing me of elder abuse, just so he could steal the family trust. He wanted to completely erase my sacrifice. He wanted to brand me as a criminal and a manipulator in front of our entire religious community. He thought I was weak and exhausted. He thought the heavy burden of caregiving and the crushing grief of losing both our parents would make me roll over and surrender everything to him just to make the nightmare stop. He thought I would be too tired to fight back against his expensive lawyers. He was incredibly wrong. I did not cry in that church hall. I did not scream at him across the room. I did not drop to my knees. I looked across the fellowship hall at my brother in his expensive suit, and I felt a cold and calculating anger replace every single ounce of sorrow in my tired body. The grief vanished, and something made of pure steel took its place. If you are watching this video right now, I promise you one thing. I did not let him win. I am going to tell you exactly how I took this fraudulent lawsuit and quietly assembled an undeniable arsenal of evidence and turned it into the very weapon that completely destroyed Greg and his perfect Arizona life forever. Before I tell you exactly how I unraveled his entire scheme and left him with absolutely nothing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to this channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy stories where the scapegoat finally fights back and wins. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I love connecting with people who truly understand what it means to carry the heavy burden for an often ungrateful family. Keep watching because what I did next changed everything. The drive back from the church was a surreal and disjointed blur. I gripped the steering wheel of my 10-year-old sedan so hard, my knuckles turned a sharp and bloodless white. Every bump in the road sent an ache radiating through my exhausted body. My bones still throbbed from standing at the cemetery in the freezing rain while watching 2 caskets being lowered into the frozen Ohio earth. I had not slept for more than 3 consecutive hours in over a year. The plain black morning dress I wore felt like a lead weight pulling me down into the driver's seat. I pulled into the driveway of my parents' suburban house. This was the house I had lived in for the past 3 agonizing years. The house that had slowly transformed from a warm childhood sanctuary, filled with laughter, into a sterile and terrifying hospital, and now finally into a suffocating prison. I walked through the heavy front door, and the absolute silence of the entryway hit me like a physical blow to the chest. When you spend years caring for the actively dying, your brain becomes hardwired to the constant noise of survival. I was so used to the rhythmic and mechanical hum of the oxygen concentrator working in the corner of the living room. I was accustomed to the sharp and terrifying beeps of medical monitors and the soft but urgent shuffling of hospice nurses walking rapidly across the hardwood floors in the middle of the night. Now there was nothing. Just the deafening and oppressive silence of an empty house and the heavy manila envelope burning a hole in my calloused hands. I walked into the kitchen and sat down at the scarred oak table. This was the exact same table where I had spent countless nights mashing my father's food into a paste he could safely swallow and sorting my mother's endless array of pills into little plastic daily compartments. The house still smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol, stale linen, and that lingering and unmistakable scent of slow decay. I dumped the contents of the lawsuit envelope onto the scratched wooden surface. The legal jargon was incredibly dense, filled with intimidating phrasing and aggressive corporate posturing. But I am an educated woman. I read through the injunctions, the affidavits, and the demands with widening eyes. Greg had not just sued me. He had filed an aggressive emergency motion to completely freeze every single asset associated with the family trust. Every checking account, every investment portfolio, the small life insurance policies, and the legal deed to this very house. The lawsuit viciously claimed I had systematically manipulated our parents in their final days. It painted a fabricated picture of me as a calculating predator, claiming I was a severe financial danger to the estate. But the immediate and crushing reality of the document was far more terrifying than the insult to my character. With the entire estate locked down and frozen in probate court, I'd absolutely zero access to the trust funds that were legally supposed to cover the house's mounting property taxes and utility bills. I was trapped. I had sacrificed my income, my career, and my independence to do the honorable thing, and now I was legally barred from the very safety net my parents had promised would catch me. The walls of the quiet kitchen suddenly felt like they were shrinking and closing in on me inch by inch. I desperately needed answers. I needed to hear my own brother explain how he could stand in a holy sanctuary accepting tearful condolences from our community while his expensive lawyers were actively trying to destroy my life. I picked up my phone with trembling fingers and dialed Greg's familiar number. It rang 4 times. I fully expected it to go straight to voicemail. I expected him to be a coward and hide behind his legal counsel. But the line clicked open. A sudden burst of bright and cheerful background noise flooded through the speaker. I heard the sharp and distinct thwack of a golf club hitting a ball, followed immediately by the polite clapping of a small crowd. I heard crystal glasses clinking and people laughing loudly. They were at an exclusive country club resort, celebrating while I was drowning. "Hello," a woman's voice answered. It was not Greg, it was his wife, Brittany. Brittany was the exact kind of woman who wore spotless white tennis skirts in the middle of December and regularly complained to management about the service at 5-star restaurants. "What do you want, Clara?" she asked. Her voice was dripping with absolute annoyance, treating me as if I had rudely interrupted her luxury spa day instead of calling about a massive and life-ruining lawsuit. "Put my brother on the phone right now, Brittany," I said. My voice shook with a mixture of grief and fury, but I forced it to stay low and steady. "Greg is incredibly busy right now," she replied casually, completely unbothered. "He is talking to the club manager about upgrading our membership tier to the platinum level, which is honestly a nightmare to coordinate. He really does not have the time or the energy to deal with your drama today." My drama. I repeated the words slowly, feeling a hot and blinding spike of anger pierce straight through my physical exhaustion. He just had a process server ambush me with a lawsuit at our own parents' funeral reception. He is officially accusing me of elder abuse and fraud. I want to know why he is doing this. Brittany sighed loudly into the phone, producing an exaggerated sound of profound boredom. Oh, please, Clara, do not play the innocent victim here with me. We all know exactly what you are trying to do over there. You isolated them from the rest of the world. You deliberately kept Greg away so you could sink your claws into the family money before they died. You kept him away, I screamed, unable to hold back the raw emotion any longer. He lives in Arizona. I begged him on my hands and knees to come visit them. I called him crying and begging him to help me physically lift our father out of the bathtub because my back was giving out. He never showed up. He chose to stay away every single time. He is building an empire. Clara Brittany said, her tone smug, elitist, and utterly condescending. He is a highly successful investment banker with massive corporate responsibilities. He is the head of this family now that your father is gone. He deserves the entire estate because he actually knows what to do with wealth. You are just an unemployed spinster who brainwashed two vulnerable and dying people because you had absolutely nothing else going on in your pathetic life. You never had a real career. You were just a high school history teacher. Greg actually contributes to the economy. The sheer cruelty and delusion of her words physically took my breath away. Spinster. Brainwashed. I had willingly given up my tenured and beloved teaching job. I had forfeited my state pension. I had stopped dating, stopped traveling, and stopped living a normal life, all to wipe their parents' mouths clean, their soiled sheets, and hold their frail hands while they cried out in pain in the middle of the night. And to Brittany, I was nothing more than a sad and lonely woman who had schemed for years just to steal an aging suburban house. The estate legally belongs to Greg Brittany, continued completely unbothered by my shocked silence. It is his birthright and his legacy. We are putting in a massive custom pool at the Scottsdale house, and the contractors are demanding a fortune. We are certainly not going to let you drain the trust accounts just because you feel entitled to a fat paycheck for playing nurse. Playing nurse. My vision blurred with hot tears of pure and unadulterated rage. I did not play Nurse Brittany. I kept them breathing, I kept them comfortable, and I paid for it with my own blood and sweat. If you or Greg think I am going to roll over and let him steal everything after he abandoned them in their darkest hour, you are completely out of your mind. Brittany let out a short, mocking and tinkling laugh. You do not have the financial resources to fight us, Clara. Greg's lawyers are the most aggressive in the state. They will drag this out until you are entirely bankrupt. Do yourself a massive favor and start packing your bags today. The house is ours. She ended the call with a sharp click. The line went completely dead, leaving me sitting alone, listening to the hollow and mocking dial tone. I lowered the phone slowly and stared blankly at the kitchen wall. The horrible truth was that she was right about one crucial detail. I did not have the resources to fight a protracted legal battle. I opened the banking application on my phone. I needed to see exactly how bad the financial damage truly was. The screen loaded and the digital numbers stared back at me like a cruel and twisted joke. Primary checking account, $312. Emergency savings account, $45. I navigated over to my retirement portal. The retirement account I had proudly built during my demanding but deeply fulfilling years as a high school history teacher. I loved my students. I loved my classroom. I gave it all up without a second thought because family was supposed to mean everything. The account that was supposed to guarantee my future security was completely gone. Current balance zero. I sat there in the quiet and dim kitchen and traced the ghosts of my vanished money. I remembered exactly where every single dollar had gone. 2 years ago, when standard Medicare refused to cover the full-time and specialized in home hospice nurses, my mother desperately needed to manage her failing heart. I withdrew $20,000. I paid the massive early withdrawal penalty fees. I paid the heavy taxes. I wrote the agonizing checks so my mother could die with dignity and peace in her own comfortable bed instead of a cold and sterile state facility. 6 months later, my father's rapid onset dementia drastically worsened, and his diabetes spiraled completely out of control. The specialized and fast-acting insulin he required was outrageously expensive. The custom mobility ramps we had to install for the front porch, the mechanical adjustable hospital bed for the living room, the pureed nutritional meals, the adult diapers, the endless insurance copays for neurological specialists who only ever offered bad news. Every single expense came directly out of my own pocket. I had systematically drained my entire life savings to keep the Hayes family afloat. Whenever the medical bills piled up to impossible heights, I would swallow my pride and text Greg. I would send him scanned pictures of the massive invoices. I would plead with him to contribute just a tiny fraction of the cost. He always had a slick and corporate excuse ready to fire back. "The market is taking a severe downturn right now, Clara," he would text back. "All of my liquid assets are currently tied up in commercial real estate ventures. I am facing severe liquidity issues this quarter." But I saw the glossy photos Brittany posted on her public social media accounts. The brand new luxury vehicles in their driveway, the first-class flights to tropical resorts, the designer handbags that cost more than a full month's worth of my father's life-saving insulin. Greg absolutely had the money. He just refused to spend a single dime of it on the people who gave him life. His only contribution over 3 grueling and agonizing years consisted of cheap and generic flower arrangements. On their birthdays, a local discount florist would deliver a standard and uninspired bouquet of carnations that smelled like cheap plastic and wilted within 48 hours. No phone call, no physical visit, just dying flowers and empty and hollow excuses. I had financially ruined myself to honor our parents and keep them safe while Greg preserved his immense wealth and patiently waited for them to die. And now he was using that exact same wealth to crush me into the dirt. I was abruptly pulled from my dark thoughts by the loud and rumbling sound of the mail carrier's truck idling at the curb outside. I heard the familiar and sharp squeak of the metal mailbox opening and closing. It was a jarring reminder of the mundane routine of the outside world simply continuing while my entire universe was collapsing. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, pushed my wooden chair back, and walked out the front door. The Ohio afternoon air was bitterly cold, a biting wind stinging my face and numbing my bare hands. The suburban neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. Perfectly manicured lawns, quiet and peaceful streets, normal people living normal and untroubled lives behind closed doors. I opened the mailbox and pulled out a thick stack of envelopes. It was mostly useless junk mail, glossy supermarket flyers, and cheap sympathy cards from distant and disconnected relatives who had not even bothered to attend the funeral service. But hidden right in the middle of the stack was a thick and rigid envelope made of heavy brown paper. It was certified mail from the county tax assessor's office. My stomach immediately tightened into a hard and painful knot. I walked back inside, locked the heavy wooden door firmly behind me, and carried the ominous envelope to the kitchen counter. I grabbed a dull butter knife from the drawer and sliced open the heavily glued top. I pulled out the official and stamped document. The letters were printed in bold and stark black ink that seemed to scream up at me. Notice of tax foreclosure and intent to evict. My eyes frantically scanned the page, trying to comprehend the terrifying blocks of legal text. During the last brutal year of my parents' lives, things had gotten incredibly desperate. The mounting medical bills had completely overwhelmed my depleted finances. I had been forced to make impossible and heartbreaking choices every single month. Do I pay the property taxes, or do I buy the heart medication that keeps my mother breathing? Do I pay the county government, or do I pay the overnight hospice nurse so I can sleep for just 3 hours without waking up to the sound of my father falling out of bed in confusion? I chose the medication. I chose the nurses. I chose humanity over bureaucracy. I had assumed foolishly and naively that once my parents passed away, the estate trust would be unlocked, and I could easily settle the back due taxes before the county ever took serious action. But Greg had filed his malicious lawsuit. The assets were frozen solid. The trust was legally locked down in probate court, completely and entirely out of my reach. The notice was brutally clear and completely unforgiving. The property taxes were severely delinquent. Because the estate was now trapped in a contested legal battle with no clear owner able to make payments, The county was moving forward with immediate foreclosure proceedings to aggressively recover their money. I read the final and highlighted paragraph, and the kitchen floor seemed to drop out from underneath me. I had exactly 30 days to pay the massive outstanding balance in full. If the payment was not received in certified funds, the property would be seized by the government, the locks would be changed, and I would be forcibly removed from the premises by the county sheriff. 30 days. I dropped the heavy paper onto the counter. I looked around the silent kitchen. I looked at the worn linoleum floor where I had paced in tears late at night. I looked at the window where my mother used to sit in her wheelchair and watch the birds. I had 30 days before I was thrown out onto the freezing street. I had $300 to my name. I had no job to return to, no savings left to draw from, and a brother who was actively and gleefully trying to destroy me. I was entirely alone, and my back was pressed so hard against the wall I could barely draw breath. But as I stood there, staring at the foreclosure notice, the rising tide of panic slowly began to subside, leaving behind a cold, sharp, and terrifying realization. Greg thought this would break me. He thought the imminent threat of homelessness and absolute ruin would force me to surrender and hand him the keys to the family kingdom. He thought I was just a tired and broken caregiver who would quietly disappear into the night without a fight. He had absolutely no idea what a woman with nothing left to lose is truly capable of. 2 days after the funeral, the Ohio sky was a flat and unforgiving gray. I had forced myself to leave the house for the first time since the process server ambushed me at the church. I needed to go to the local pharmacy to finalize some paperwork regarding my parents' outstanding medical accounts. It was a mundane and depressing errand, the kind of invisible administrative burden that falls entirely on the caregiver after the actual caregiving ends. I remember standing in the fluorescent aisle of the drugstore, staring blankly at a row of sympathy cards and feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. I was gone for exactly 45 minutes. That was all the time Greg needed to make his move. I turned my 10-year-old sedan onto my quiet suburban street and instantly felt the air leave my lungs. A white commercial van was parked directly in my driveway. Bold blue lettering on the side read, "Advanced Security and Locksmith Services." Standing on the front porch of my childhood home wearing a tailored navy overcoat that probably cost more than my car was my brother. Greg was pointing aggressively at the heavy wooden front door, while a man in a gray uniform leaned forward with a heavy power drill. I slammed the car into park at the curb and scrambled out before the engine had even fully stopped. My boots hit the freezing pavement, and I sprinted across the frosted grass of the front lawn. The sharp and mechanical whine of the drill pierced the quiet neighborhood air. I shouted at them to stop, right now. My voice tore through the quiet street loud and desperate. The locksmith jumped back, startled, and lowered his drill. Greg simply turned around slowly and looked down at me from the elevated porch. He did not look like a grieving son. He looked like a corporate landlord preparing to evict a nuisance tenant. He had a smug and entirely relaxed expression on his face, as if he were merely swatting away a minor annoyance. Greg crossed his arms and told the locksmith to keep working. He casually stated that I was an unauthorized occupant and that he was legally securing the family property. I ran up the concrete steps and placed my body directly between the locksmith and the front door. I looked the worker dead in the eye and told him that if he touched that lock again, I would press charges for breaking and entering. The poor man looked completely bewildered and glanced back and forth between the two of us. Greg let out a loud and patronizing sigh. He reached into the inner pocket of his expensive coat and pulled out a folded piece of heavy legal paper. He waved it in my face like a winning lottery ticket. He announced loudly, making sure his voice carried across the lawn, that he held the official power of attorney for the estate. He claimed he had full legal authority to secure the premises because he had reason to believe I was destroying valuable assets and compromising the integrity of the home. I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Mrs. Gable, a retired teacher who had lived next door for 20 years, was standing on her front porch wrapped in a thick wool shawl. 2 houses down, Mr. Henderson had stopped walking his golden retriever and was openly staring at us. My cheeks burned with sudden and intense humiliation. Greg was deliberately creating a public spectacle. He wanted the neighborhood to see me acting hysterical. He wanted to construct a narrative right there on the front lawn. I told Greg that our parents were gone and that any old power of attorney he held expired the absolute second their hearts stopped beating. I told him he had absolutely no right to lock me out of the house I had maintained with my own blood and sweat for 3 agonizing years. Greg stepped closer to me. His expensive cologne smelled like cedar and arrogance, completely masking the scent of the bitter winter wind. He lowered his voice so only I could hear the pure venom in his words. He whispered that it did not matter what I thought. He said he had the expensive lawyers, he had the resources, and he had the paperwork. He told me I was nothing but a squatter, living on his future inheritance, and he was going to make sure I left with nothing but the clothes on my back. I did not waste another breath arguing with a man who had no soul. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and dialed 911. I told the dispatcher that a man was attempting to illegally break into my residence. The 10 minutes it took for the police to arrive felt like an absolute eternity. We stood on the porch in heavy silence. The locksmith packed up his tools and wisely retreated to his van, wanting absolutely no part of this bitter family war. Greg simply leaned against the brick pillar, checking his expensive watch and scrolling through messages on his phone, completely unbothered by the fact that his own sister had just called the cops on him. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, their red and blue lights flashing silently against the gray afternoon sky, casting harsh shadows across the dead winter grass. 2 officers approached the porch with their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. I immediately stepped forward and explained the situation. I told them I had lived in this house for 3 years as the sole full-time caregiver for our late parents. I explained that my brother, who lived in Arizona and had not visited once in 3 years, was trying to illegally change the locks and throw me out onto the freezing street. The older officer held up a gloved hand to stop me and then turned to Greg. Greg instantly shifted his entire demeanor. The smug corporate shark vanished and was immediately replaced by the deeply concerned and responsible older brother. It was a performance worthy of a stage actor. Greg handed the officer the folded legal document. He spoke in a calm and measured tone, expressing deep worry for the property. He claimed I had been acting incredibly erratic since the funeral. He explicitly used the words elder abuse and financial manipulation, telling the police he was simply trying to secure his parents' legacy from an unstable sibling. The officer unfolded the paper and reviewed it carefully. It was a general power of attorney document my parents had signed 5 years ago, back when Greg was still pretending to be a dutiful son, and long before the severe dementia had taken hold of my father. I knew for a fact that my parents had drafted a newer trust, but it was currently locked away and completely frozen by Greg's malicious lawsuit. The officer handed the paper back to Greg and sighed heavily. He looked at me with an expression that was halfway between pity and profound irritation. The officer explained that because both property owners were recently deceased, and because there was currently an active lawsuit contesting the estate, the house was trapped in probate limbo. He told Greg he could not legally change the locks today because I had established long-term residency. But then, he turned to me and delivered a warning that chilled me to the very bone. He said that while Greg could not kick me out this afternoon, my legal position was incredibly precarious. Because I was not listed on the immediate deed, and the estate was violently contested, I was technically living in a highly vulnerable gray area. The officer advised me to retain aggressive legal counsel, immediately warning that civil courts rarely favored the occupant in these bitter estate disputes. The police eventually instructed Greg to leave the premises to avoid a breach of the peace. Greg agreed with a polite and respectful nod to the officers, but as he walked past me to head toward his rental car, he paused. He looked at the peeling paint on the front door, and then he looked directly into my tired eyes. He smiled a cold and terrifying expression that I will never forget. He promised me that he would be back with a signed court order, and that next time the police would be the ones dragging me out by my hair. He drove away, leaving me standing on the porch, trembling uncontrollably. The physical threat of the eviction attempt was terrifying, but the psychological warfare was only just beginning. Greg realized he could not simply break down my door, so he decided to violently poison the very ground I walked on. 2 days after the police incident, the doorbell rang. I was sitting in the kitchen, surrounded by mountains of unpaid medical bills, trying to figure out how I was going to afford basic groceries for the week. I opened the heavy front door and found Pastor Miller standing on the porch. Pastor Miller had been the spiritual leader of our local church for 15 years. He had baptized me. He had stood beside my parents' hospital beds. He had delivered their dual eulogies just days ago. I felt a sudden wave of relief wash over me. I thought he was here to offer pastoral comfort and to check on my well-being after the devastating loss of my parents. I invited him inside and offered him a cup of hot tea. We sat in the formal living room, the room my mother had always kept impeccably clean for guests. But the atmosphere was incredibly tense. Pastor Miller would not meet my eyes. He stared at his teacup shifting uncomfortably on the floral sofa and clearing his throat multiple times. Finally, he placed his cup on the saucer with a loud clatter and folded his hands in his lap. He told me that this was an incredibly difficult visit for him to make. He said he was speaking to me not just as a pastor, but as a highly concerned member of the community. My chest tightened painfully. I asked him what was wrong. He took a deep breath and explained that Greg had requested a private meeting with the church elders earlier that week before flying back to Arizona. Pastor Miller said that Greg had shared some deeply troubling information regarding my parents' final months. The pastor used careful and diplomatic words, but the meaning hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. He mentioned that Greg had raised severe concerns about isolation. He said Greg had presented documentation suggesting that I had deliberately kept my parents away from their friends, their extended family, and their church community. He hinted at disturbing allegations of medical neglect, suggesting that Greg genuinely believed I had withheld proper care in order to hasten their passing and seize control of the family finances. I sat completely frozen in my chair. The room began to spin. I could hear the blood rushing loudly in my ears. I asked Pastor Miller if he actually believed those horrific lies. I reminded him that I had brought my father to church every single Sunday until his dementia made it physically impossible to leave the house. I reminded him that I had quit my career, drained my entire life savings, and sacrificed my youth to keep them breathing. The pastor looked incredibly pained, but he did not offer the fierce defense I so desperately needed. He sighed softly and said that grief often distorts our memories. He suggested that perhaps the heavy burden of caregiving had overwhelmed my judgment without me even realizing it. He gently advised me to step down from my volunteer position on the church outreach committee, stating that the congregation needed time to process these serious allegations and that my presence might be a distraction to the ministry. He was asking me to leave the only support system I had left. Greg had not just sued me. He had not just tried to make me homeless. He had systematically assassinated my character in the very community where I had lived my entire life. He had painted me as a monster, an abusive predator who preyed on her own dying parents. And the most terrifying part was that people were actually believing his polished and expensive lies over my exhausted and desperate truth. I stood up slowly and asked the pastor to leave my house. He looked surprised, perhaps expecting me to fall to my knees and beg for forgiveness for sins I had never committed. I walked him to the door, my posture rigid and my heart turning into a block of solid ice. I watched him drive away, taking with him the last shred of my belief in the goodness of my community. I locked the heavy wooden door and slid down to the floor of the entryway, pulling my knees tightly to my chest. The silence of the empty house pressed down on me with a crushing weight. I was completely isolated. My parents were dead, my bank accounts were empty. The neighborhood thought I was a squatter, and the church thought I was an abuser. Greg wanted me to break. He wanted me to feel so surrounded, so utterly defeated and ashamed that I would simply sign over the estate and disappear into the night just to make the relentless pressure stop. He thought the heavy burden of social isolation would crush my spirit faster than any expensive lawyer ever could. But as I sat on that cold hardwood floor, surrounded by the ghosts of the people I had loved and cared for, the crushing despair began to evaporate. It was rapidly replaced by a profound and absolute clarity. There was no appealing to Greg's humanity because he did not possess any. There would be no tearful family reconciliation. There would be no compromise. My brother had declared total war, and he had chosen to fight extremely dirty. He was relying on my lifelong habit of staying quiet and taking the high road to secure his easy victory. I realized then that if I continued to play the role of the good and quiet and sacrificial daughter, I was going to lose absolutely everything. If I wanted to survive, I had to stop waiting for someone to save me. I had to become the exact monster he was telling everyone I was, but only to him. I had to completely dismantle his entire life with the exact same ruthless precision he was using to dismantle mine. I stood up from the floor, wiping the last tears I would ever shed over my brother from my tired face. I looked up at the ceiling, toward the dusty and sweltering attic where my father had stored his oldest files. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to hunt. The house was completely silent after the church pastor finally drove away. I stood alone in the dim entryway and listened to the heavy pendulum of the antique grandfather clock ticking in the formal living room. Every single second that passed felt like a loud and rhythmic countdown to my own destruction. The police officer had warned me that my legal position was incredibly precarious. Greg had filed his malicious lawsuit and successfully trapped the entire family estate in a complicated probate limbo. The county tax office was actively threatening immediate foreclosure within 30 days. I had absolutely no access to the trust funds that were supposed to maintain the property, and my own personal bank accounts were completely drained. If I was going to survive this nightmare and save the roof over my head, I needed hard and undeniable proof. I needed the physical paper trail showing the courts that I had personally paid the massive mortgage and every single medical bill for the past 3 grueling years. My father was an incredibly meticulous man before the severe dementia slowly stole his sharp mind. He kept obsessive records of everything he ever purchased or promised, but I had already scoured his downstairs office from top to bottom. I had emptied every green metal filing cabinet and checked every false bottom in his heavy mahogany desk drawers. I had even ripped up the old carpets in the guest bedroom, searching for a hidden floor safe. There was only one place left in the entire house to look: the attic. I walked down the narrow upstairs hallway and reached high above my head to grab the frayed nylon cord dangling from the ceiling. I pulled down the wooden attic stairs with a hard yank. The old springs shrieked and the wooden steps creaked loudly, groaning under their own heavy weight as they unfolded. A wave of trapped and sweltering heat immediately washed over my tired face. It was the middle of the afternoon, and the pale winter sun was somehow beating down relentlessly on the dark roof shingles. The air up there was thick and stagnant, smelling heavily of dry wood rot and dust and decades of forgotten family history. I climbed the wooden steps very slowly. My legs were still incredibly heavy with the bone-deep physical exhaustion of round-the-clock caregiving and the fresh, agonizing grief of burying my parents. But sheer desperation is a highly powerful fuel. I pushed myself up into the dim and stifling space. The only illumination came from a single bare bulb hanging from a rusted pull chain in the exact center of the exposed wooden rafters. I yanked the chain, and the yellow light flickered to life, casting long and terrifying shadows across massive mountains of taped cardboard boxes and stacked plastic storage bins. It was a truly suffocating environment. The stagnant heat pressed down hard on my chest, making it difficult to draw a full and steady breath. Sweat instantly prickled along the back of my neck and soaked into the collar of my shirt. I wiped my damp forehead with the back of my rough hand and forced myself to get to work. I started near the front of the attic, sorting through heavy boxes of old winter coats and moth-eaten wool blankets that smelled of cedar and decay. I opened brittle plastic bins filled with faded childhood photo albums and cracked high school yearbooks. Every single box I opened felt like digging my bare hands through the silent graveyard of my own family. I was desperately looking for financial salvation, but all I found were the hollow memories of a childhood life that felt completely foreign to me now. I found my old debate team trophies wrapped in newspaper. I found the delicate porcelain dolls my mother used to collect before her heart began to fail. I sat on the hard floorboards surrounded by these useless ghosts and felt a deep and terrible panic begin to claw at the fragile edges of my mind. Hours passed in the sweltering silence. The oppressive heat in the attic soaked right through my clothing, causing my shirt to cling uncomfortably to my skin. My hands and knees were covered in a thick layer of gray dust and black grime. My lower back ached with a dull and throbbing pain from bending and lifting heavy crates in the cramped space under the slanted roof. I was rapidly running out of boxes to check, and I was running out of hope. What if the mortgage receipts were completely gone? What if Greg had somehow found them during a secret visit and destroyed them before he filed his fraudulent lawsuit? What if I truly had absolutely nothing left to fight him with in probate court? I pushed my way toward the very back corner of the attic, where the slanted roof met the rough floorboards. There was a massive and imposing wall of heavy cardboard boxes stacked unevenly against the exposed wooden support beams. They were clearly labeled in my mother's neat and cursive handwriting. The thick black marker read, "Christmas decorations and holiday ornaments." I dragged the heavy boxes aside one by one. The thick cardboard scraped loudly against the rough floorboards, kicking up fresh clouds of choking dust. I moved a box filled with fragile glass ornaments and another heavy crate filled with tangled strings of colored outdoor lights. Behind the very last box, hidden completely out of sight in the darkest and most inaccessible corner of the eaves, I finally saw it. It was a heavy industrial steel firebox. It was dark gray and covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust, proving it had not been touched or moved in several years. It was roughly the size of a small microwave oven, and it looked incredibly heavy. I dropped to my knees, crawling over the wooden joists, and brushed the thick dust off the top with my bare hand. There was a solid brass padlock securing the heavy metal latch on the front. My father had deliberately hidden this secure box behind the seasonal holiday decorations, knowing nobody would ever casually stumble upon it during a routine cleaning. I grabbed the metal handle and tugged hard, but the brass padlock held incredibly firm. I did not have the combination, and I did not have a key. I had never even seen this gray firebox before in my entire life. I sat back on my tired heels and stared at the lock. I was entirely too exhausted to search the entire 4-bedroom house for a tiny hidden key that might not even exist anymore. I was too desperate to care about preserving my father's damaged property. I wiped the stinging sweat from my eyes and climbed back down the creaking attic stairs. I walked straight into the downstairs kitchen and opened the heavy utility drawer. I pushed past the screwdrivers and the rolls of tape and pulled out my father's solid steel claw hammer. I climbed back up into the sweltering attic, carrying the heavy tool. My heart was pounding a frantic and uneven rhythm against my ribs, echoing loudly in my ears. I knelt in front of the gray firebox and gripped the rubber handle of the hammer with both of my hands. I raised it high above my head and brought it down violently against the brass padlock. The sharp crack of metal striking metal echoed fiercely through the small confined space, making my ears ring with the sheer volume. The lock did not break. I raised the heavy steel hammer again and swung much harder this time, channeling every single ounce of raw grief and bone-deep exhaustion and white-hot anger I possessed into the heavy metal head. I hit the brass lock a third time. I swung and hit it a fourth time, panting heavily in the stifling heat. On the fifth violent strike, the brass shackle finally snapped with a loud and satisfying crunch that sent a jagged piece of metal spinning across the floorboards. I dropped the heavy hammer onto the floor beside my knees. My chest was heaving as I reached out with trembling and dirt-covered fingers to pull the broken padlock free from the hasp. I unhooked the metal latch and slowly pushed the heavy steel lid open. The old hinges groaned in loud protest. I leaned forward into the dim light, fully expecting to find thick and neatly bound stacks of medical invoices and faded mortgage receipts. I expected to find the exact legal paperwork I desperately needed to prove to the bank that I was the one who had kept this family afloat. I did not find a single receipt. The heavy firebox was completely empty, except for one large object resting perfectly flat at the very bottom. It was a thick, leather-bound accounting ledger. It was dark forest green with reinforced brass corners and a deeply worn spine that showed years of constant handling. I reached inside the metal box and lifted it out. The aged leather felt cool and substantial in my dirty hands. I opened the thick cover and slowly turned to the very first crisp page. The aged pages were completely filled with perfectly straight columns of numbers and dates, written in my father's unmistakable and meticulous architectural handwriting. It was an exact chronological record of private financial transactions. I scanned the first page, trying to make sense of the neat rows of blue ink. The very first entry was dated exactly 7 years ago. That was 4 full years before my father's devastating dementia diagnosis and 4 years before I willfully gave up my beloved teaching career to become their full-time medical nurse. I traced my trembling finger along the faded blue lines. The left column listed the specific date, the middle column listed a massive monetary amount, and the right column listed the exact destination of the money along with a brief justification. I read the very first row. It documented a cash transfer of $15,000. The destination listed was an emergency capital injection for Greg's newly formed limited liability company. I turned the heavy page. 3 months later, there was another entry. This one documented a wire transfer of $22,000. The destination was listed as an emergency bridge loan to keep Greg's commercial real estate venture from collapsing. I flipped rapidly through page after page of immaculate financial records. My breath caught sharply in my throat, and the sweltering, oppressive heat of the attic suddenly felt freezing cold against my damp skin. This green leather ledger was a devastating and meticulously maintained record. It tracks hundreds of thousands of dollars in secret wire transfers sent to Greg's failing LLCs. I sat completely frozen on the hard wooden floorboards, entirely unable to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal I was holding in my hands. I turned to the next thick section of the ledger, where the numbers grew even larger. It was not just failed business loans. My father had meticulously tracked every single dollar he and my mother had secretly funneled to my arrogant brother over the course of 7 long years. There were massive wire transfers explicitly labeled to cover the down payment on Greg's sprawling Scottsdale mansion. There were massive cash checks written to clear the luxury vehicle loans for Brittany's designer cars. There were deeply shameful transfers to cover Greg's lavish country club initiation fees and his expensive tropical golf retreats. I stared blindly at a specific entry dated just 2 years ago. The blue ink documented a transfer of $18,000 to cover Greg's emergency tax burden because he had mismanaged his own corporate accounts. My vision instantly blurred with hot tears of absolute unadulterated fury. I remembered that exact month perfectly. It was burned into my memory forever. That was the exact same month my mother's cardiovascular specialist had recommended an expensive experimental heart medication that standard Medicare absolutely refused to cover. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table late at night, crying quietly over the household budget because my parents claimed they simply did not have the liquid cash to pay for the pills. I had drained my own emergency savings account and skipped my own meals for weeks just to buy that medication and keep my mother breathing comfortably. All this time, I truly believed my parents were the struggling and innocent victims of a broken healthcare system. I deeply believed they were financially ruined by the astronomical high cost of aging in America. I had willingly and lovingly sacrificed my youth and my career and my own financial future because I believed they desperately needed my financial help to survive the winter. But they were never broke. They had massive reserves of cash hidden away in their diverse retirement accounts. They simply chose to look me in the eye and lie to my face. They let me drain my own modest teacher's salary to buy their groceries so they could quietly funnel their massive wealth directly into Greg's greedy pockets. They had literally watched me struggle to pay the utility bills while they wired thousands of dollars across the country so my sister-in-law could drive a brand new luxury SUV to her tennis lessons. They allowed me to bathe them and feed them and sacrifice my entire social life for them, while they secretly and continuously funded the very man who abandoned them in their darkest hour. I reached back into the cold steel firebox because I noticed a thin manila envelope tucked tightly against the back wall behind where the ledger had rested. I pulled it out and opened the metal clasp with numb fingers. Inside was a thick stack of printed emails. They were ongoing correspondences between my father and Greg, dating back several years. I unfolded the crisp white papers and began to read the printed words. These were not the polite or humble requests of a struggling son asking for a temporary favor. They were aggressively hostile and deeply manipulative demands. Greg's emails were filled with toxic corporate jargon, heavily mixed with cruel emotional blackmail. He demanded immediate capital injections from their retirement accounts to save his failing vanity investments. He explicitly threatened to cut my parents off entirely and strictly ensure they would never see their future grandchildren if they refused to wire him the exact amount of money he demanded by the end of the business day. And below his threats were my father's desperate and enabling responses, begging Greg not to cut them out of his life and promising that the wire transfer was already processing at the bank. I sat alone in the sweltering heat of the silent attic, surrounded by the dusty and decaying remnants of my family history, holding the absolute, undeniable proof of my own lifelong exploitation. I did not feel sad anymore. The crushing grief I had carried like a lead weight since the funeral completely evaporated into the hot air. The paralyzing fear of the county foreclosure notice vanished entirely. The bitter humiliation of the church pastor's visit dissolved into nothingness. A new and terrifying clarity washed over me, replacing my grief with something made of pure, unbreakable steel. I was not the beloved and loyal daughter making a noble family sacrifice. I was just the unpaid and expendable labor, hired to protect the golden child's hidden inheritance. I was the convenient sacrificial lamb, deliberately chosen to bear the heavy financial and emotional burden so Greg could live in absolute luxury without ever facing a single consequence for his failures. I carefully folded the printed emails and placed them back into the manila envelope. I closed the heavy green leather ledger and ran my hand over the worn cover. I held the book tightly against my chest like a protective shield. Greg had confidently filed a massive lawsuit accusing me of elder abuse and financial manipulation to steal the estate before I could ever see the truth. He had aggressively tried to lock me out of my own home and maliciously destroy my reputation in our tight-knit religious community. He thought I was incredibly weak and exhausted and completely defenseless. But my arrogant and greedy brother had made one fatal and spectacular miscalculation in his grand scheme. He had forgotten that our father was a man who compulsively documented absolutely everything he ever did. Greg thought he was suing me to easily take whatever money was left in the trust. He did not realize he had just unknowingly handed me the exact weapon I needed to take back every single dime he had stolen from me over the last 7 years. I stood up slowly and brushed the thick gray dust from my knees. The suffocating heat of the attic no longer bothered me. I walked toward the wooden stairs carrying the green ledger that was going to completely dismantle his perfect Arizona life. I sat completely still on the rough wooden floorboards of the sweltering attic. The heavy green leather ledger rested in my lap like an anchor pulling me down into a dark and terrifying ocean. My hands were covered in a thick layer of gray dust and grime from breaking open the steel firebox, but I could not bring myself to wipe them clean. I could not bring myself to move at all. The oppressive heat pressing down from the roof shingles was suffocating, but the air trapped in my lungs felt entirely frozen. I stared at the meticulous columns of blue ink in my father's familiar handwriting. I traced my trembling index finger down the list of dates and massive monetary figures. My mind, which had been trained for years as a professional tax accountant, began to automatically align the dates in the ledger with the darkest and most desperate memories of my own life. I did not want to connect the dots. I desperately wanted to believe there was some massive misunderstanding, but numbers do not lie. Numbers do not care about family loyalty or emotional sacrifice. I stopped at a specific entry dated exactly 2 years and 4 months ago. The ledger documented a wire transfer of $25,000 sent directly to a limited liability company owned entirely by my brother Greg. The justification written neatly in the margin was emergency capital for Scottsdale property expansion. My vision blurred as a vivid and agonizing memory crashed over me. 2 years and 4 months ago was the exact same time my mother's cardiovascular specialist told us she needed a highly specialized home healthcare aide. The doctor had been very clear that standard Medicare would not cover the full cost of the 24-hour supervision she required to stay alive. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table with my parents that very evening. My mother was weeping softly into a tissue. She looked so incredibly frail and frightened. She told me she felt like a terrible burden. She said she and my father were on a fixed income and simply did not have the liquid cash to afford the out-of-pocket medical expenses. She cried and said she would just have to go into a cheap state-run facility and wait for the end. I remembered the absolute panic that had gripped my chest that night. I remembered holding her fragile hand and promising her I would never let that happen. The very next morning, I logged into my own retirement portal and liquidated a massive portion of my savings. I paid the crushing early withdrawal penalty fees and the heavy taxes without a second thought. I drained the money I had worked so hard to save during my teaching career, just so my mother could die with dignity in her own comfortable bed. And right there in this green ledger was the undeniable proof that on the exact same week, they sat at the kitchen table crying about being broke. They had quietly wired $25,000 to Greg. They let me drain my own modest teacher salary to buy their groceries and pay their medical bills, while they secretly funneled their massive wealth directly into my brother's greedy pockets. I turned the thick page with numb fingers. 6 months later, there was another entry. $14,000 transferred to cover the commercial lease on a boutique retail space. It was a vanity business project for Greg's wife, Brittany. That was the exact same month my father's rapid onset dementia took a terrifying turn. He needed a mechanical adjustable hospital bed installed in the living room and a custom wheelchair ramp built for the front porch. I had worked exhausting freelance copywriting jobs late into the night, surviving on 3 hours of sleep just to pay the contractors because my parents claimed their savings were completely depleted. I sat alone in the dim attic and felt a fundamental piece of my soul shatter into a million jagged pieces. All this time, I truly believed my parents were the struggling and innocent victims of a broken and unfair healthcare system. I deeply believed they were financially ruined by the astronomical high cost of aging in America. I had willingly and lovingly sacrificed my youth and my career and my own financial future because I believed they desperately needed my help to survive the brutal winter of their lives. But they were never broke. They had massive reserves of cash hidden away in diverse investment accounts. They simply chose to look me right in the eye and lie to my face. They literally watched me struggle to pay the basic household utility bills while they wired thousands of dollars across the country so my sister-in-law could open a designer clothing boutique that failed 6 months later. They allowed me to bathe them and feed them and sacrifice my entire social life for them while they secretly and continuously funded the very man who completely abandoned them in their darkest hour. I closed the heavy ledger and set it gently on the dusty floorboards. I needed more answers. I needed to know exactly how deep this toxic poison ran in my family. I crawled over the exposed wooden joists toward the back corner of the attic where my father had stored his old electronics. Sitting on a sturdy folding table beneath a tarp was his heavy desktop computer. It was the machine he used to use for his personal banking before his mind started to fail. I pulled the plastic tarp away and blew the dust off the keyboard. I found the power cord tangled in a cardboard box and plugged it into a nearby wall outlet. I pressed the power button and held my breath. The old machine groaned loudly. The internal fan hummed to life with a vibrating rattle, and the monitor slowly flickered on, casting a harsh and bright blue light into the dim and sweltering attic. I pulled up a small wooden stool and sat in front of the glowing screen. The computer was not password protected. My father had always trusted that nobody in the house would ever snoop through his private office files. I opened his primary email client and used the search function to look for any messages containing Greg's name. The screen instantly populated with hundreds of results dating back over 7 years. I clicked on the very first email thread that caught my eye. It was from 3 years ago, right around the time I first quit my teaching job to become their full-time caregiver. I began to read the digital messages, and the betrayal I felt from the ledger suddenly compounded into something far more sinister. These were not the polite or humble requests of a struggling son asking his parents for a temporary financial favor. They were aggressively hostile and deeply manipulative demands. Greg's emails were a masterclass in emotional extortion. He wrote in a cold and corporate tone, heavily mixed with cruel emotional blackmail. He demanded immediate capital injections from their retirement accounts to save his failing commercial real estate investments. He claimed the market was against him and that he needed liquidity to survive. But it was the threats that made my blood run entirely cold. Greg explicitly threatened to cut my parents off entirely if they did not comply. He wrote that Brittany was feeling very alienated by the family dynamic, and that if they refused to wire him the exact amount of money he demanded by the end of the business day, he would strictly ensure they would never see their future grandchildren. He told them they would die alone in Ohio without ever holding a child of his if they failed to support his entrepreneurial vision. I scrolled down with trembling hands to read my father's replies. I fully expected to see my father push back. I expected to see the strong and principled man who had raised me demand respect from his arrogant son. Instead, I read the desperate and enabling responses of a man held completely hostage by his own desperate need for his golden child's approval. My father begged Greg not to cut them out of his life. He apologized profusely for causing Greg any stress. He promised that the massive wire transfer was already processing at the bank and begged Greg to send them a recent photograph of Brittany. I clicked on another thread from just 14 months ago. Greg was demanding $18,000 to cover an emergency tax burden because he had severely mismanaged his own corporate accounts. My father replied that their liquid funds were running dangerously low and that they were worried about paying for my mother's upcoming heart medications. Greg's response was swift and absolutely ruthless. He replied that I was living in their house rent-free and that I should be the one carrying the burden of the daily medical costs. He told my father to stop coddling me and demand that I step up and pay for the medications myself. He then reiterated his threat to spend the upcoming holidays with Brittany's family exclusively if the tax money was not wired by Friday. My father wired the $18,000 that Thursday, and the very next week, he sat at the kitchen table and cried to me about the cost of the heart medication until I drained my emergency fund to pay for it. I pushed the wooden stool back and stood up. The bright blue light from the computer monitor illuminated the swirling dust motes in the stagnant attic air. I looked around the suffocating space, surrounded by the decaying remnants of my childhood and the absolute, undeniable proof of my own lifelong exploitation. Something profound happened to me in that exact moment. The crushing grief I had carried like a lead weight since the funeral completely evaporated into the hot air. The paralyzing fear of the county foreclosure notice vanished entirely. The bitter humiliation of the church pastor's visit dissolved into nothingness. I did not feel sad anymore. I did not feel like crying. A new and terrifying clarity washed over me, replacing my grief with something made of pure, unbreakable steel. I realized I was not the beloved and loyal daughter making a noble family sacrifice. I had never been the beloved daughter. I was just the unpaid and expendable labor hired to protect the golden child's hidden inheritance. I was the convenient sacrificial lamb deliberately chosen to bear the heavy financial and emotional burden so Greg could live in absolute luxury without ever facing a single consequence for his endless failures. My parents had not been helpless victims of a broken system. They had been willing participants in my destruction. They had deliberately allowed me to sacrifice my career and my youth to shield their favored son from his own incompetence. They had chosen Greg's comfort over my survival every single time. And now, Greg was using the very wealth I had sacrificed to protect to completely destroy me in probate court. I reached back into the steel firebox because I noticed a small stack of loose papers tucked tightly against the back wall where the ledger had rested. I pulled them out. They were old tax documents and copies of my parents' wills. But tucked right in the middle of the stack was a crisp white business card. The heavy cardstock bore the name Harrison Cole Attorney at Law, specializing in complex probate litigation and estate recovery. I stared at the embossed black letters. I remembered Harrison Cole. He was a sharp and silver-haired estate attorney who had secretly visited our house to advise my parents just a few months before they passed away. I had assumed it was a routine update to their healthcare directives. I had no idea they were hiding a massive financial conspiracy. I held the business card tightly in my calloused hand. Greg had confidently filed a massive lawsuit accusing me of elder abuse and financial manipulation to steal the estate before I could ever uncover the truth. He had aggressively tried to lock me out of my own home and maliciously destroy my reputation in our tight-knit religious community. He thought I was incredibly weak and exhausted and completely defenseless. He thought the heavy burden of social isolation would crush my spirit faster than any expensive lawyer ever could. But my arrogant and greedy brother had made one fatal and spectacular miscalculation in his grand scheme. He had completely forgotten that our father was a man who compulsively documented absolutely everything he ever did. Greg thought he was suing me to easily take whatever money was left in the trust. He did not realize he had just unknowingly handed me the exact weapon I needed to take back every single dime he had stolen from me over the last 7 years. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I looked at the battery icon. I had exactly enough charge left to make one incredibly important phone call. I dialed the number printed on the crisp white business card. The line rang 3 times before a deep and professional voice answered. "Harrison Cole speaking." "Mr. Cole," I said. My voice was no longer shaking. It was completely level and absolutely freezing cold. "My name is Clara Hayes. I'm Thomas and Catherine Hayes' daughter." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Clara He said, his tone shifting into something careful and measured. "I was wondering when you might call me. I heard about the lawsuit your brother filed against you this morning. He filed it to freeze the assets before I could find the truth." I replied, stating the fact with absolute clinical precision. "But he was too late. I am standing in my father's attic right now. I have his hidden financial ledger, and I have printed copies of every single extortion email Greg sent over the last 7 years. I can prove a massive pattern of financial elder abuse, and I can prove that my brother has been systematically draining the estate while I paid for everything out of pocket." There was a much longer pause this time. When Harrison Cole finally spoke again, I could hear the distinct sound of a shark smelling blood in the water. "Clara," he said, his voice suddenly sharp and fully engaged, "I need you to gather every single document you just found. Do not let anyone else into that house. Do not speak to your brother, and do not answer the door for the police without calling me first. Can you bring the ledger and the emails to my office first thing tomorrow morning? I will be there at 8, I promised." I ended the call and slid the phone back into my pocket. I carefully gathered the green leather ledger and the printed emails, holding them tightly against my chest like a protective shield. The suffocating heat of the attic no longer bothered me at all. I walked toward the wooden stairs, ready to climb down and begin the silent war that would completely dismantle my brother's perfect life. The drive into the city the next morning felt entirely different from the agonizing and tear-filled drive home from my parents' funeral. I was no longer a grieving and exhausted daughter, paralyzed by the crushing fear of foreclosure. I was a woman holding a loaded weapon in the form of a heavy green leather ledger and a stack of printed extortion emails. I parked my tired and rattling 10-year-old sedan outside a sleek glass and steel high-rise building in downtown Columbus. The massive lobby was covered in polished white marble and radiated an atmosphere of quiet, intimidating authority. I rode the silent elevator up to the 40th floor, grasping my heavy canvas tote bag so tightly against my side that my arm ached. The receptionist directed me down a long carpeted hallway to a massive corner office overlooking the city skyline. Sitting behind a sprawling mahogany desk was Harrison Cole. He was exactly as I remembered from the brief and mysterious glimpse I had of him at my parents' house a few months before they passed away. He had thick silver hair, perfectly tailored expensive clothing, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate every single detail in the room simultaneously. He stood up when I walked in and offered a firm and professional handshake. He did not offer empty platitudes or fake sympathy about my parents' passing. He did not treat me like a fragile victim. He simply pointed to a heavy leather chair across from him and told me to sit down and tell him everything. I pulled the heavy firebox ledger and the thick stack of printed emails from my bag and placed them squarely on his immaculate desk. I told him my brother Greg had ambushed me with a process server at the funeral reception. I told him Greg had filed an aggressive emergency motion to freeze the estate and evict me from the family home. I told him about the humiliating power of attorney stunt on my front lawn in front of all my judgmental neighbors. Harrison opened the green ledger and traced his long index finger down the first column of my father's meticulous handwritten numbers. He read through the printed emails in absolute silence. He was quiet for a very long time. The only sound in the massive office was the soft and rhythmic ticking of a heavy brass clock on the wall. When he finally looked up from the documents, his expression was incredibly sharp and deeply dangerous. He leaned forward and told me he had met with my parents privately 6 months ago because my father had briefly experienced a small window of mental clarity. My parents wanted to secretly restructure the family trust. Harrison explained that my parents were absolutely terrified of Greg. They were terrified he would completely drain their remaining retirement accounts and leave my mother with absolutely nothing to pay for her specialized medical care. But before the new trust could be finalized and legally recorded with the county, my father's dementia rapidly worsened and my mother's fragile heart finally failed. Harrison folded his hands and explained exactly what my brother was doing. Greg's aggressive civil lawsuit was not just an act of simple greed. It was a highly calculated and malicious preemptive strike. Greg knew perfectly well that he had systematically stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from vulnerable elders. He knew he had committed severe and highly illegal financial abuse. By immediately suing me for elder abuse the very second our parents were in the ground, Greg was attempting to seize total control of the public and legal narrative. He desperately wanted to tie up the entire estate in probate court and force a quick and quiet settlement before anyone ever had the chance to look closely at the actual bank statements. He wanted to bankrupt me financially and crush me emotionally, so I could not afford to hire an investigator to look into his past. But Greg did not know about the hidden attic firebox. And he certainly did not know that I had just walked into the office of the most ruthless probate litigator in the entire state of Ohio. Harrison told me we were going to wage a silent and absolute war. He said the greatest legal advantage we possessed right now was Greg's towering and blinding arrogance. Greg genuinely believed I was a weak and exhausted former teacher who would simply fold and surrender under the massive pressure of a corporate lawsuit. Harrison instructed me to lean heavily into that exact stereotype. I was to do absolutely nothing that would alert my brother to the fact that we were building a massive and undeniable counterattack. The very first step was bringing in a professional forensic accountant. Harrison hired a brilliant woman named Sarah, who specialized specifically in unraveling complex financial fraud hidden within large family estates. For the next 3 weeks, my entire life revolved around Sarah's secure digital portal and long late-night meetings at the law firm. We took my father's meticulous green ledger and we went hunting for the truth. Because Greg had arrogantly opened the door to litigation by suing the estate first, Harrison was legally able to file quiet emergency subpoenas for the financial records of Greg's Arizona limited liability companies. The local courts granted the subpoenas because we presented preliminary hard evidence of commingled family funds. What we discovered over those grueling 3 weeks was far worse and far more sickening than anything I had imagined while sitting in that sweltering attic. Sarah meticulously cross-referenced the exact dates of my father's wire transfers with Greg's personal and corporate spending habits. We built a massive and bulletproof timeline printed on giant white presentation boards in Harrison's secure conference room. We tracked a specific wire transfer of $40,000 that my father sent in late October. 3 days after that money cleared Greg's corporate business account, the exact same amount was wired to a luxury car dealership in Scottsdale to purchase Brittany's brand new designer SUV. We tracked another massive transfer of $35,000, explicitly labeled in my father's ledger as emergency medical loans for my mother's failing heart. Sarah followed the complex digital paper trail and easily proved that the money went directly to pay for Greg's exorbitant initiation fees at an exclusive desert country club and a custom waterfall swimming pool installation at his massive mansion. Every single time my parents had begged me to pay for groceries out of my meager teaching salary, every time I had drained my own emergency savings to cover their basic utility bills, it was because Greg was literally taking the food out of their mouths to fund a lavish lifestyle of pure vanity. He had aggressively extorted over $400,000 from his dying parents, while simultaneously mocking me on the phone for not earning a higher income. Sitting in that freezing air-conditioned conference room, looking at the undeniable and color-coded proof of his massive theft, I felt a cold and mechanical focus take over my entire mind. The heavy grief of losing my parents was entirely gone. The paralyzing fear of the county foreclosure notice was completely replaced by a singular, burning purpose. We were not just going to defend against his fraudulent and insulting lawsuit. We were going to completely dismantle the false empire he had built on the back of my lifelong sacrifice. While Harrison and Sarah built the financial guillotine behind closed doors, I had to play my part flawlessly out in the real world. The hardest thing I have ever had to do in my entire life was pretending to be broken and defeated while knowing I held the absolute power to destroy the man who was actively trying to ruin me. I ignored the aggressive and nasty phone calls from Brittany's country club friends who were clearly put up to harassing me day and night. I walked past the highly judgmental stares of my former church neighbors, with my head bowed and my shoulders severely slumped, playing the pathetic part of the ashamed and defeated daughter. I wore old baggy sweatpants to the local grocery store and let the dark exhaustion circles under my eyes grow even deeper. I wanted anyone reporting back to Greg to tell him exactly what his massive ego desperately wanted to hear. Clara is falling completely apart. Clara has absolutely no fight left in her. Clara is going to surrender at any moment. The humiliating facade worked perfectly. 2.5 weeks into our silent and secret investigation, a courier arrived at my front door, holding a formal legal letter from Greg's highly expensive Arizona attorneys. I carried the heavy envelope into the silent kitchen and opened it with absolute and chilling calm. It was a formal settlement offer. The legal language printed on the thick paper was incredibly insulting and deeply condescending. Greg's lawyers formally stated that in the interest of preserving family harmony and out of the goodness of his own generous heart, my brother was willing to drop the elder abuse and fraud charges against me. He would generously allow me to avoid a humiliating and highly public trial that would ruin my reputation forever. In exchange for this mercy, I had to immediately sign over my entire legal right to the family house, forfeit any future claim to the remaining trust funds, and vacate the premises within 14 days. As a grand gesture of goodwill, the document stated Greg would pay me a one-time settlement of exactly $10,000. $10,000. He wanted me to completely walk away from my childhood home, my rightful inheritance, and 3 agonizing years of my sacrificed youth for a pathetic $10,000, while he sat comfortably in a desert mansion, fully funded by my parents' stolen retirement money. The sheer audacity and delusion of the offer was breathtaking. He truly believed I was stupid. He believed I was so terrified of the county foreclosure notice and so deeply intimidated by his corporate lawyers that I would eagerly take his spare change just to escape the nightmare he had created. I immediately drove the document down to Harrison's downtown office. When I walked into the corner room and slid the insulting lowball settlement offer across the polished mahogany desk, Harrison read it and actually chuckled out loud. It was a dark and deeply dangerous sound that echoed in the quiet room. He looked up at me and told me this was the exact catastrophic mistake he had been patiently waiting for them to make. By officially submitting this formal and insulting offer, Greg was officially locking his false narrative into the legal court record. He was showing a future judge that he genuinely believed he held all the power, all the leverage, and all the assets. He was acting exactly like a guilty man, trying to buy a cheap exit before the truth came out. Harrison instructed me not to respond to the offer under any circumstances. Not yet. We were going to deliberately let the mandatory legal deadline for the response completely expire in silence. We were going to let Greg stew in his own toxic arrogance, believing I was simply too paralyzed by fear and poverty to even hire a lawyer to sign the paperwork. We needed him feeling absolutely invincible and completely untouchable for the next critical phase of our plan. I drove back to the empty and quiet suburban house that afternoon, feeling a strange and powerful sense of absolute peace. The terrifying foreclosure notice was still pinned to my kitchen refrigerator, but it no longer held a single ounce of terror over my life. The county tax office could threaten whatever they wanted because I knew something they did not. This house was not going anywhere, and neither was I. The silent war was almost entirely over. The trap was fully set and perfectly baited. All I had to do now was wait patiently for the mandated pre-trial deposition where my brother would arrogantly walk right into the heavy steel jaws of his own total destruction. The morning of the mandatory pre-trial deposition arrived with a bitter and freezing Ohio wind that rattled the windows of my empty childhood house. I stood in the quiet kitchen and drank a cup of black coffee while watching the frost cover the dead grass in the front yard. Today was the day I had to walk into a room and sit across from the brother who was actively trying to destroy my life. I dressed carefully for the occasion. I deliberately chose an old gray cardigan that was slightly frayed at the cuffs and a pair of simple dark trousers. I wore no makeup. I pulled my hair back into a loose and messy knot. I needed to look exactly like the exhausted, broken, and defeated woman that Greg firmly believed I was. I drove my rattling 10-year-old sedan to the towering glass and steel high-rise building in downtown Columbus, where Greg's expensive corporate attorneys had rented a massive executive conference room. Harrison Cole was already waiting for me in the polished marble lobby. He looked immaculate in a dark charcoal pinstripe suit, and he was holding a simple leather briefcase. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his sharp blue eyes evaluated me the second I walked through the revolving doors. He nodded in absolute approval at my tired and worn appearance. He pulled me aside near the elevator bank and spoke in a low and measured tone. He reminded me of the strict legal strategy we had spent weeks building in absolute silence. He told me that today was not the day we demanded justice. Today was not the day we revealed the green leather ledger or the stack of printed extortion emails. Today was the day we handed my arrogant brother a shovel and quietly watched him dig his own financial and legal grave. I was instructed to look deeply intimidated. I was told to keep my shoulders severely slumped and to speak softly and to let Greg believe he held absolute power over my future. I took a deep breath and nodded. I knew exactly how to play the role of the helpless and beaten-down caregiver because I had actually lived that terrible nightmare for 3 agonizing years. We rode the silent elevator to the 42nd floor and walked into the conference room. It was an incredibly intimidating space that was clearly designed to make opposing parties feel small and insignificant. The room was paneled in rich mahogany wood with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the gray city skyline. A massive granite table stretched down the center of the room. A licensed court reporter was already set up in the far corner, and her fingers hovered patiently over a small black typing machine that would permanently record every single word spoken that day. Harrison and I took our seats on one side of the cold stone table. Greg and his wife Brittany arrived exactly 15 minutes late. It was a classic and calculated corporate power play designed to make us wait and sweat. They pushed through the heavy glass doors, laughing at a private joke and looking like they had just stepped off the cover of a wealthy lifestyle magazine. Greg wore a custom-tailored navy suit that fit his shoulders perfectly, and he paired it with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie. His hair was styled with expensive product, and a heavy gold watch gleamed brightly on his wrist every time he moved his hand. Brittany was wrapped tightly in a camel-colored cashmere coat, and she carried a designer leather handbag that easily cost more than my entire first-year salary as a history teacher. They radiated an overwhelming and toxic aura of pure arrogance and absolute entitlement. Greg did not even look at me when he pulled out his heavy leather chair and sat down directly across the table. He acted as if I was entirely invisible. Brittany offered me a tight and performative smile of pure condescension before pulling out her latest smartphone and completely ignoring my existence. Greg's lead attorney was a shark of a man in an expensive light gray suit. He introduced himself with a smug smile and slapped a thick file onto the table, and the deposition officially began. The opposing lawyer started by deposing me. For 2 grueling and humiliating hours, he aggressively questioned me about my parents' final days and my own personal finances. He used harsh and demeaning and rapid-fire language designed to confuse and rattle me. He asked if it was true that I was completely unemployed and unemployable. He asked if I had relied entirely on my dying parents for a roof over my head and food on my plate. He painted a disgusting and entirely fictional picture for the court record of me as a bitter and lazy and calculating spinster who had deliberately isolated our vulnerable parents from their highly successful son in order to maliciously leech off their remaining retirement funds. Every single instinct in my body screamed at me to fight back. My chest burned with righteous fury. I desperately wanted to stand up and scream the absolute truth into his smug face. I wanted to tell that expensive lawyer about the endless sleepless nights and the heavily soiled bed sheets and the agonizing emergency hospital visits in the middle of the winter. I wanted to tell him about the absolute hell of watching the 2 people I loved slowly suffocate from heart failure while my brother played luxury golf in the Arizona desert. But every time my temper flared, I felt Harrison Cole gently tap his leather shoe against mine under the heavy granite table. It was our secret and silent signal to hold the line and stick to the plan, so I swallowed my pride. I looked down at my rough and calloused hands resting on the table. I answered every aggressive question in a quiet and trembling and pathetic voice. I allowed my shoulders to cave inward. I even let a single genuine tear of frustration roll down my pale cheek when he directly accused me of elder abuse. Across the table, Greg leaned back in his comfortable leather chair and crossed his arms. A look of profound and sickening satisfaction settled completely over his face. He truly believed he had completely broken my spirit. He thought I was utterly crushed by the legal pressure. After a short recess, it was Greg's turn to be formally deposed under oath. Harrison Cole stood up slowly and deliberately, buttoned his suit jacket with the stiff and careful movements of an old man. He did not look like a dangerous predator. He looked like a bored and tired and defeated estate lawyer, just going through the mundane motions of a lost cause. He spoke to Greg in a soft and accommodating and almost deferential tone. He asked Greg to state for the official court reporter exactly how he had managed his personal and corporate finances over the past 7 years. Greg eagerly swallowed the bait whole. He puffed out his chest and adjusted his silk tie and began to brag loudly for the official record. He talked endlessly about his sprawling investment firm and his brilliant commercial real estate ventures and his unmatched entrepreneurial mind. He used complicated corporate buzzwords to sound important. He painted himself as a self-made titan of industry who had achieved massive and independent wealth entirely on his own merit and hard work. Harrison paced very slowly near the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city skyline. He turned and politely asked Greg if he had ever relied on his parents for any financial support during his adult life. Greg actually laughed out loud. It was a sharp and mocking and cruel sound that echoed loudly in the quiet conference room. Greg leaned forward and looked directly at the court reporter and swore under penalty of perjury that he was completely and entirely financially independent from our parents. He stated for the official legal record that he had never asked for a single dime from Thomas and Catherine Hayes. He shamelessly claimed that he was the one who frequently offered them large sums of cash, but that they had proudly refused his generous charity. And then, feeling absolutely invincible and entirely untouchable, Greg went completely off script. His massive ego pushed him to twist the knife deeper. He looked directly across the granite table at me, with a cruel sneer playing on his lips, and told the court reporter that it was a profound family tragedy, how his sister had systematically drained the family trust for her own selfish needs. He swore under oath that Clara was the absolute sole financial burden on the Hayes family. He testified that I was a parasite and that he was forced to file this emergency lawsuit merely to protect his beloved parents. Final legacy from my unchecked greed. I watched Harrison Cole pause mid-step. The atmosphere in the conference room shifted so violently and so suddenly that I could almost feel the physical change in the air pressure. Harrison walked slowly back to the heavy table and rested his hands flat on the polished stone. He looked directly at my brother. Harrison's voice was no longer soft or tired or deferential. It was cold and sharp and razor-thin. He addressed Mr. Hayes, and his voice rang with a new and terrifying clarity. He stated that he wanted to be absolutely certain the court reporter had the sworn statement correct today. He asked Greg to confirm that he was swearing under penalty of perjury that he had never received any financial assistance or wire transfers or cash gifts from his parents in the last 7 years. He asked if that was his official testimony. Greg scoffed and rolled his eyes like a petulant teenager annoyed by a stupid question. He said yes, that is completely correct, and that he was entirely self-made. He stated clearly that he had never taken their money. Harrison did not blink. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Greg like a sniper finding a target. He said he would ask a second time, just so there was absolutely no confusion on the record. He asked Greg to officially testify under oath that he had never taken a single dollar from Thomas and Catherine Hayes to secretly fund his lifestyle or his businesses or his personal property. Greg's expensive lead attorney shifted very uncomfortably in his leather chair. His eyes darted toward Harrison because he was sensing a sudden and dangerous trap, but Greg was entirely too blinded by his own towering arrogance to notice the subtle warning signs in the room. Greg loudly declared absolutely not, and his voice dripped with condescension. He stated that not one single dollar had ever transferred from their accounts to his. He proudly announced that he was the wealthy one in the family and not them. Harrison leaned across the table and closed the physical distance between them. He said he would ask a third and final time. He asked Greg if he was absolutely certain of his absolute financial independence from the deceased. Greg snapped angrily and slammed his hand flat against the granite table. He said he was positive. He declared that his unemployed sister was the only person who ever stole from the family and demanded that the court reporter write that down in the record. The massive steel trap snapped completely shut with a resounding and undeniable crack. Harrison did not reach into his briefcase to pull out my father's green leather financial ledger. He did not pull out the thick stack of printed extortion emails proving Greg had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars. He did not reveal our hand. He simply stood up straight and smiled a chilling and predatory smile that made the blood drain entirely from the opposing lawyer's face. Harrison thanked Greg for confirming his absolute financial independence for the official court record. His tone dripped with lethal satisfaction. He turned to the bewildered court reporter and told her that we were entirely done here today and that she could pack up her machine. Greg's attorney looked deeply confused and suddenly panicked. He quickly spoke up and desperately mentioned the $10,000 lowball settlement offer they had mailed to me weeks ago. He asked in a rushing voice if we were ready to sign the settlement paperwork and take the pathetic $10,000 and formally surrender the estate today to avoid further humiliation. Harrison picked up his simple leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. The sound echoed in the room like a gunshot. He looked down at Greg and Brittany with absolute and unvarnished disgust. Harrison demanded that the official record show that Clara Hayes formally and completely rejected the plaintiff's insulting settlement offer. His voice boomed with undeniable authority. He stated that we would not be settling this matter for $10,000, and we would not be settling this matter for any amount. He looked Greg dead in the eye and promised that we would see him in the county probate court. Harrison highly suggested that Greg bring a criminal defense attorney with him because his current civil counsel was completely unprepared for what was about to happen to his life. The heavy oak doors of the county probate courthouse swung shut behind me, and the loud echo bounced off the cold marble floors. It was a Tuesday morning. Outside, the Ohio skies were pouring freezing rain, but inside the building, the air was dry and smelled strongly of floor wax and old paper. I walked down the long corridor beside my attorney, Harrison Cole. My hands were empty. I did not carry a purse or a briefcase or a single piece of paper. Harrison carried everything we needed inside his battered leather briefcase. He had specifically instructed me to walk into that courtroom looking exactly like a woman who had nothing left to hide and absolutely nothing left to lose. We entered courtroom number 4 and took our seats at the dark wooden defense table. The room was intimidating and solemn. High ceilings, polished mahogany walls, and rows of empty wooden benches meant for public viewing. Greg and his wife Brittany were already seated at the plaintiff's table. They looked like they were attending a wealthy charity brunch rather than a trial about our dead parents. Greg wore a custom-tailored navy suit that fit his shoulders perfectly. His hair was impeccably styled. Brittany was wearing a designer silk blouse and checking her makeup in the reflection of her smartphone screen. When Greg saw me sit down, he leaned back in his heavy wooden chair and offered me a small and pitying smile. It was the exact same smug look he had given me in the church fellowship hall when he handed me the lawsuit. He was absolutely certain he was going to walk out of this building as the sole owner of our family estate. The judge entered the room. She was an older woman with sharp gray eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She took her seat at the elevated bench and formally called the court to order. Greg's expensive-led attorney immediately stood up to deliver his opening statement. He was a tall man with a booming theatrical voice designed to fill large rooms and intimidate witnesses. For the next 2 hours, I had to sit in absolute silence while this man systematically assassinated my character for the official legal record. He paced back and forth in front of the judge's bench and painted a horrific and entirely fictional picture of my life. He described me as a bitter, unemployed spinster who had completely failed to launch her own career. He told the judge that I had deliberately moved back into my parents' house, not to care for them, but to prey upon their vulnerability. He used words like calculated manipulation and elder isolation. He claimed that I had maliciously intercepted phone calls and turned away visitors to ensure my parents were entirely cut off from the outside world. The lawyer spoke with such fierce conviction that if I had not actually lived through the nightmare of the past 3 years, I might have believed him myself. He painted Greg as the tragic and loving golden son. He claimed Greg was a highly successful businessman who was deeply desperate to help his failing parents, but was constantly blocked by his jealous and controlling sister. According to the lawyer, I had deliberately withheld critical medical care from our parents in order to hasten their passing, so I could seize control of the family trust. It was agonizing to listen to. My chest burned with a righteous and suffocating fury. Every single instinct in my body screamed at me to stand up and shout the truth. I wanted to scream about the endless sleepless nights and the soiled bedsheets and the terrifying emergency hospital visits in the middle of winter. I wanted to demand where Greg was when our father forgot how to swallow his own food. But I felt Harrison Cole press his hand firmly against my wrist under the table. It was his silent command to stay perfectly still. He wanted Greg to feel invincible. He wanted the lies to pile up as high as possible before we knocked the entire foundation out from underneath them. After the opening statements, Greg's lawyer called his first witness. It was Pastor Miller, the very same church pastor who had visited my home and awkwardly asked me to step down from my volunteer committee based on Greg's malicious rumors. The pastor took the witness stand looking incredibly uncomfortable. He swore on the Bible to tell the truth. Under direct examination from Greg's lawyer, Pastor Miller repeated the exact narrative Greg had fed him. He testified in a soft and sorrowful voice that he had noticed a disturbing shift in my parents' final year. He claimed that I had stopped bringing my father to Sunday services. He stated that whenever church members tried to visit the house, I would often turn them away at the front door, claiming my parents were too tired for company. He testified that Greg had called him weeping with concern because he could not get through to his own mother and father. The lawyer thanked the pastor and sat down looking incredibly pleased with himself. The courtroom narrative was firmly established. I was the controlling monster and Greg was the helpless victim. Then Harrison Cole stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket slowly. He did not look angry. He did not raise his voice. He walked toward the witness stand with the calm and methodical pacing of a man who held all the winning cards in his hand. Harrison greeted the pastor politely and thanked him for his concern for the Hayes family. Then he began his cross-examination. He asked Pastor Miller to confirm exactly how many times he had personally visited my parents' house in the last 3 years of their lives. The pastor blinked and shifted in his wooden chair. He estimated perhaps 4 or 5 times. Harrison nodded slowly. He asked the pastor to describe the medical equipment located in my parents' living room during those visits. The pastor looked confused. He could not answer. He mumbled something about a hospital bed. Harrison pressed gently but firmly. He asked if the pastor knew how to operate the heavy oxygen concentrator that kept my mother breathing. The pastor said no. Harrison asked if the pastor knew the exact dosage of rapid-acting insulin my father required every 4 hours to prevent a diabetic coma. The pastor shook his head and said he was not a medical professional. Harrison stepped closer to the stand. His voice rang with a sudden and piercing clarity. He asked the pastor who exactly was operating that oxygen machine. He asked who was administering that insulin at 3 o'clock in the morning. He asked who was physically lifting my father out of the bathtub when his legs failed him. The pastor looked down at his hands and quietly admitted that Clara did all of those things. Harrison did not let up. He asked Pastor Miller how many times Greg Hayes had accompanied the pastor on those home visits over 3 years. The pastor admitted Greg had never been there. Harrison asked how many times Greg Hayes had attended Sunday service with his parents in the last decade. The pastor admitted it had been many years. Then Harrison delivered the final blow. He asked the pastor if he was aware of who was actually paying the monthly church tithes on behalf of the Hayes family during those 3 difficult years. The pastor hesitated and then confirmed that the checks were always signed by Clara Hayes. Harrison thanked the pastor and dismissed him. The shift in the courtroom was immediate and palpable. The judge leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands, and looked directly at Greg. Greg's smug smile had completely vanished. He was sitting rigidly in his chair, his face draining of color. Brittany had stopped checking her phone and was staring at Harrison Cole with wide and nervous eyes. Greg's lawyer scrambled to recover. He quickly called his second witness. It was my Aunt Susan, a distant relative who lived 2 towns over and loved nothing more than family gossip. She took the stand wearing a bright floral dress. She eagerly testified that I was always a very difficult and dramatic child. She told the court that I had deliberately isolated my mother from her extended family. She claimed she had tried to call my mother for her birthday, but I had answered the phone and rudely refused to let her speak. Harrison Cole stood up for his second cross-examination. He approached Aunt Susan with a dangerously polite smile. He asked her for the exact date of that birthday phone call. She proudly stated it was October 12th of last year. Harrison walked back to his defense table and picked up a single sheet of paper. He read from it clearly. He stated that on October 11th, the day before that phone call, my mother had suffered a minor stroke and had been rushed to the emergency room. He asked Aunt Susan if she was aware that when she called to chat about birthday plans, my mother was heavily sedated and recovering from a traumatic neurological event. Aunt Susan gasped and covered her mouth. She stammered that nobody had told her. Harrison asked her who she thought was sitting by that hospital bed for 48 straight hours holding her sister's hand. Aunt Susan looked at me sitting quietly at the defense table, and her eyes filled with sudden tears. She whispered my name. Harrison asked her how many times Greg had visited the hospital during that stroke recovery. Aunt Susan admitted she did not know. Harrison raised his voice so it echoed off the mahogany walls. He asked Aunt Susan if she had ever once offered to come over and wash my mother's clothes. He asked if she had ever offered to buy groceries so I could sleep for just a few hours. He asked if she had ever contributed a single dollar to the mounting medical bills that were crushing our family. Aunt Susan began to cry openly on the witness stand. She shook her head and admitted she had not done any of those things. She admitted she had simply listened to Greg when he told her I was handling everything perfectly fine on my own. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the sound of Aunt Susan crying. The entire smear campaign that Greg had spent weeks carefully constructing in our community was completely collapsing in real time. The expensive legal narrative painting me as a master manipulator was crumbling into dust. The witnesses Greg had brought to destroy me were instead going on the official court record and legally testifying to my absolute devotion and my endless sacrifice. I looked across the aisle at my brother. Greg was practically hyperventilating. His expensive lawyer was furiously flipping through his legal pads, desperately trying to find a way to stop the bleeding. They had walked into this courtroom expecting an easy victory over a broken and exhausted woman. They had expected me to cower and cry and surrender. Instead, they were facing a ruthless legal dismantling. And the most terrifying part for Greg was that Harrison Cole had not even opened the heavy leather briefcase yet. We had just destroyed Greg's entire character assassination using only his own witnesses. We had not even introduced the hidden financial ledger or the printed extortion emails. The financial exposure was still coming, and Greg had absolutely no idea the trap was already locked tight around his throat. The heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom seemed to hold in the suffocating tension that had just settled over the room. Pastor Miller and Aunt Susan had already retreated to the back benches, their faces pale and their eyes fixed firmly on the floor. The elaborate and expensive lie that my brother had paid his corporate lawyers to construct was lying in absolute ruins across the polished floor. I sat at the defense table with my back perfectly straight. I did not look back at the gallery, and I did not look at my brother. I kept my eyes entirely focused on Harrison Cole. My attorney stood near the center aisle. He smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit and turned his sharp blue eyes toward the judge. The true battle was only just beginning. The character assassination was over. It was time for the financial execution. Harrison approached the judge's elevated bench and requested permission to introduce new documentary evidence into the official court record. The judge nodded and leaned forward, peering over her reading glasses. Harrison walked back to our table and reached into his battered leather briefcase. He did not pull out a stack of pristine legal papers. He pulled out the heavy, dark green leather ledger I had broken out of my father's hidden attic firebox. He held it up for the entire courtroom to see. The worn brass corners caught the harsh fluorescent lighting. Across the aisle, I saw Greg physically flinch. His tailored navy suit suddenly seemed to fit him a little too tightly. He recognized that green ledger. He knew exactly what our father had used it for. Harrison formally submitted the ledger into evidence alongside a massive stack of certified and subpoenaed bank records from Greg's limited liability companies in Arizona. Greg's lead attorney immediately shot to his feet. His booming theatrical voice echoed through the room as he loudly objected. He claimed the ledger was inadmissible hearsay and an unreliable document that belonged in the trash, not in a court of law. He was desperate and sweating visibly. He knew that whatever was inside that green book was going to completely destroy his wealthy client. Harrison simply smiled a cold and predatory smile. He calmly explained to the judge that the ledger was a meticulously maintained chronological accounting record kept in the deceased property owner's own handwriting. He stated that every single transaction listed in the Green Book perfectly matched the certified bank statements obtained directly from the financial institutions. The numbers matched down to the exact penny. The judge overruled the objection with a sharp crack of her wooden gavel. The evidence was officially admitted. The trap was locked. Harrison asked the court for permission to call Greg Hayes to the witness stand. The color completely drained from my brother's face. He looked at his expensive lawyer for a lifeline, but the lawyer simply gave him a grim nod, indicating he had absolutely no choice but to comply. Greg stood up slowly. He walked across the courtroom floor with the stiff and mechanical movements of a man marching to the gallows. He climbed the steps to the witness box and placed his hand on the Bible. He swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It was the greatest lie he had told all morning. Harrison Cole did not start by yelling. He approached the witness stand with the slow and measured pacing of a predator circling its prey. He handed Greg a crisp white sheet of paper from the evidence file. It was a printed copy of one of the emails I had found stashed in the attic safe. Mr. Hayes Harrison said, his voice carrying a dangerous, quiet authority. Please read the highlighted paragraph of this email aloud for the court record. Could you also state the date and the recipient before you begin? Greg swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously against his silk tie. His hands were visibly shaking as he held the paper. He cleared his throat twice before he could find his voice. He stated that the email was sent 2 years and 4 months ago. He confirmed the recipient was our late father. Read the highlighted portion, please, Harrison commanded. He did not say please like a request. It was an absolute order. Greg looked down at his own words and his voice cracked. If you do not wire $25,000 to my corporate account, by the end of the business day, Brittany and I will be forced to cut ties completely. We are building a life here, and we cannot be dragged down by your financial hesitation. If the money is not sent, you will never see your future grandchildren. A collective gasp rippled through the public gallery. The judge lowered her pen and stared at Greg with absolute disgust. The words were so incredibly toxic and manipulative that hearing them spoken aloud in a quiet courtroom felt like a physical violation. Harrison did not give Greg a single second to recover. He pulled a massive presentation board from behind the defense table and placed it on an easel facing the judge. It was a blown-up copy of my father's green ledger cross, referenced with Greg's subpoenaed business accounts. Harrison pointed to a specific date with a silver pen. He asked Greg to confirm that a wire transfer of exactly $25,000 had entered his corporate account on the very same day that extortion email was sent. Greg wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and quietly said yes. Harrison stepped closer to the witness stand. And could you tell the court, Mr. Hayes, what you purchased with that $25,000 just 3 days later? Greg stammered. He looked down at his lap and mumbled something completely incoherent. I cannot hear you, Mr. Hayes, Harrison said, his voice ringing out sharp and clear. Please speak into the microphone so the court reporter can record your answer. Did you use that extorted money to save a failing business? Did you use it to pay your employees? It was for a country club initiation fee, Greg whispered. His face was burning a deep and humiliated red. It was for Brittany's membership at the Desert Golf Resort. We needed it for networking. It was a business investment. A business investment. Harrison repeated the words slowly, letting the sheer absurdity of the claim hang in the dead air of the courtroom. While you were investing in luxury golf memberships, your father was suffering from rapid onset dementia, and your mother was dying of severe heart failure. Harrison turned his back on Greg and faced the judge. He pulled another document from his briefcase. He read the exact dates out loud. He showed the court that in the exact same month, Greg extorted $25,000 for a country club membership our parents had run completely out of liquid cash to pay for specialized medical care. He introduced my own personal banking records into evidence. He showed the court the massive early withdrawal penalty fees I had paid to liquidate my teacher retirement account. Harrison looked back at Greg. He asked my brother if he was aware that while he was playing 18 holes of luxury golf, his sister was draining her life savings to buy oxygen concentrators and rapid-acting insulin. He asked if Greg knew that I was washing heavily soiled bedsheets at 3 a.m. because our parents could not afford to pay the overnight hospice nurse. I did not know, Greg shouted, his voice pitching upward in panic. They never told me they were struggling that badly. I thought the money they sent me was surplus. I thought they were fine. You did not know because you never once bothered to visit them. Harrison fired back, instantly closing the distance to the witness stand. You did not know because you were entirely too busy sending them emails demanding another $14,000 to pay for your wife's designer car lease. Harrison handed Greg another email. He forced my brother to read it out loud. He forced him to read a third email where Greg demanded $18,000 to cover his own mismanaged corporate taxes while explicitly threatening to spend the upcoming holidays exclusively with his in-laws. The financial timeline Harrison had constructed with the forensic accountant was absolutely bulletproof. He methodically tracked over $300,000 flowing directly from my dying parents' retirement accounts into Greg's luxury Arizona lifestyle. With every single document introduced into evidence, Greg seemed to shrink smaller and smaller in the wooden witness chair. The arrogant and polished corporate titan who had tried to illegally change the locks on my front lawn was completely gone. He was sweating profusely through his expensive shirt. He kept loosening his silk tie as if the air in the courtroom was slowly suffocating him. He stammered out pathetic excuses, claiming the money was just a series of temporary bridge loans and that he had fully intended to pay it all back eventually. But Harrison pointed out that in 7 years of documented transfers, not one single dollar had ever been returned to the Hayes estate. I sat at the defense table and watched the man who had tormented my family for years be systematically dismantled by the absolute truth. I remembered Brittany mocking me on the phone from her golf resort, calling me an unemployed spinster who played nurse for a paycheck. I remembered Greg ambushing me at the funeral reception, trying to crush me when I was paralyzed by grief. They had truly believed that their wealth and their status made them completely invincible. They believed they could rewrite history because they had the money to hire loud lawyers. But money cannot alter the undeniable reality of an ink-stained ledger and a subpoenaed bank statement. The final and most devastating blow was still waiting. Harrison walked back to the defense table and picked up a thick bound booklet. I recognized it immediately. It was the certified transcript from the mandatory pretrial deposition we had attended weeks ago. Harrison approached the judge and submitted the transcript. He then turned back to Greg. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the heavy rain beating against the high windows. Mr. Hayes Harrison said, his tone shifting from aggressive to a chilling conversational calm. Do you recall sitting in a conference room with me exactly 3 weeks ago for a sworn pretrial deposition? Greg nodded weakly. Yes, I remember. And do you recall being placed under oath during that deposition, swearing to tell the truth under penalty of perjury? Yes, Greg whispered. Harrison opened the thick booklet to a bookmarked page. I am going to read a portion of your sworn testimony from that day, Mr. Hayes. I asked you very clearly if you had ever relied on your parents for any financial support during your adult life. You answered, and I quote, I am completely financially independent. I have never taken a single dollar from Thomas and Catherine Hayes. I am entirely self-made. End quote. Greg closed his eyes. His hands were gripping the wooden rail of the witness stand so tightly, his knuckles were stark white. I then asked you a second time. Harrison continued, raising his voice so it echoed off the mahogany walls. I asked if you were absolutely certain you had never received wire transfers or cash gifts to fund your lifestyle or your businesses. You answered absolutely not. You then explicitly stated on the legal record that your sister Clara Hayes was the absolute sole financial drain on the family, and that she was a parasite stealing your parents' legacy. Harrison closed the booklet with a sharp and resounding snap. He stared directly into Greg's panicked eyes. Mr. Hayes, you have just sat in this courtroom and confirmed the authenticity of emails where you personally demanded hundreds of thousands of dollars from your parents. You have confirmed receiving those wire transfers. You have confirmed spending that exact money on luxury cars and country club memberships. Harrison turned completely away from Greg and looked up at the judge. He let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds before delivering the final strike. So I must ask you to clarify for the court, Mr. Hayes. Were you lying today when you admitted to extorting your dying parents for $300,000? Or were you committing intentional felony perjury 3 weeks ago when you swore under oath that you had never taken a single dime? Which lie would you like to confess to today? Greg's expensive lead attorney jumped up frantically, shouting an objection, claiming his client was being badgered and harassed. But the judge was having absolutely none of it. She slammed her wooden gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. She overruled the objection instantly, her face dark with absolute judicial fury. The judge leaned over her elevated bench and glared down at Greg. Her voice dripped with unvarnished disgust. She sternly warned Greg that perjury in a civil deposition was a severe criminal offense. She stated for the official record that she found his testimony entirely lacking in credibility and his financial conduct toward vulnerable elders absolutely reprehensible. She ordered him to step down from the witness stand immediately. Greg stumbled as he climbed down the wooden steps. He looked physically ill. His knees seemed weak, and he practically collapsed into his chair at the plaintiff's table. Brittany was sitting in the gallery behind him, staring at her husband in absolute horror. The polished illusion of their perfect, wealthy life had just been shattered into a million jagged pieces in front of a gallery full of strangers. Greg had walked into this courthouse entirely convinced he was going to strip me of my childhood home and leave me completely bankrupt on the street. Instead, his own blinding arrogance had pushed him to lie under oath, permanently cementing his guilt into the public and legal record. He was absolutely ruined. His reputation was destroyed, his lies were exposed, and his legal case for the estate was completely dead. I sat quietly at my table and felt a deep and profound sense of peace wash over my tired body. The heavy burden I had carried for 3 agonizing years was finally lifting from my shoulders. But as Harrison Cole walked calmly back to the defense table and gave me a single reassuring nod, I knew the trial was not quite over. Greg thought the financial exposure was the worst thing that could possibly happen to him today. He had absolutely no idea that Harrison was about to hand the judge a sealed envelope that would completely obliterate his future forever. The heavy silence inside the county probate courtroom was absolute. The only sound was the harsh and rhythmic drumming of the freezing Ohio rain beating against the tall glass windows. Greg had just stumbled down from the witness stand and collapsed into his wooden chair at the plaintiff's table. He was panting heavily. His custom-tailored navy suit was soaked with nervous sweat. Beside him, his expensive corporate lawyer was aggressively shoving papers into a leather briefcase with jerky and defeated movements. The grand and expensive lie they had built to destroy my life was completely dead in the water. But as I sat quietly at the defense table, my attorney, Harrison Cole, did not sit down. Harrison stood perfectly still in the center aisle. He smoothed the front of his tailored suit jacket and looked up at the elevated bench. The judge was glaring down at my brother with undisguised contempt. Harrison cleared his throat, and his deep voice rang out with a terrifying clarity. "Your Honor," Harrison said, "we have established a comprehensive and undeniable timeline of severe financial elder abuse committed by the plaintiff. We have proven perjury on the official court record. But before this court considers a final ruling on the estate, there is one last piece of documentation that must be entered into the proceedings." Greg's lawyer immediately stopped packing his briefcase. His head snapped up, and he stared at Harrison with wide and panicked eyes. I watched Harrison reach his hand into the inner breast pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. He did not pull out another subpoenaed bank statement. He did not pull out another printed extortion email. He withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with a heavy pool of dark red wax and stamped with a formal county notary seal. "What is that?" Greg's lawyer demanded. His booming theatrical voice was entirely gone. It was replaced by a high and reedy tone of pure panic. "We have the final and official family trust documents from 5 years ago. We have already reviewed them. There is absolutely nothing else to submit." Harrison did not even look at the opposing lawyer. He kept his piercing blue eyes locked entirely on the judge. "This envelope contains a formal and legally binding codicil to the Hayes family trust," Harrison explained calmly. "It was drafted and executed in absolute secrecy exactly 3 weeks before Thomas and Catherine Hayes passed away. I personally facilitated the signing. It was witnessed by 2 independent medical professionals and an outside notary public to guarantee absolute mental competency. I was given strict legal instructions by the deceased to keep this document entirely sealed until this exact moment in the probate process." The judge leaned forward and extended her hand. Harrison walked to the bench and handed her the heavy envelope. I sat frozen at my table. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Harrison had kept this a total secret from me as well. During our countless late-night strategy meetings, he had never once mentioned a final codicil. He had warned me that there would be a massive surprise at the very end of the trial, but he had explicitly refused to tell me what it was. He wanted my reaction in the courtroom to be completely genuine and unscripted. The judge picked up a silver letter opener from her desk. The sharp sound of the thick paper tearing echoed loudly through the silent room. Greg was gripping the edge of his mahogany table so tightly his knuckles were stark white. His wife Brittany was sitting in the gallery directly behind him, with her hands covering her mouth. The judge pulled out 2 crisp sheets of heavy legal paper. She adjusted her reading glasses and began to read the document silently to herself. I watched her expression shift. The strict judicial neutrality melted away and was rapidly replaced by a look of profound sorrow and deep anger. She read the entire document twice. Then she slowly lowered the papers and looked directly across the courtroom at my brother. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said. Her voice was incredibly cold and sharp. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have presided over hundreds of bitter family disputes. I have seen greed and I have seen cruelty, but I have rarely read anything as tragic and as damning as the words your own parents wrote about you in their final days." Greg opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked like a man standing on the train tracks, watching the bright headlight of an oncoming engine. The judge tapped the heavy paper with her index finger. "This document contains a personal letter attached to the legal codicil. The deceased requested that it be read aloud in open court should their estate ever be contested by you. I will honor their final request now." The judge cleared her throat and began to read my parents' final words aloud to the silent room. "To whomever is presiding over the wreckage of our family, we offer our deepest apologies. If this letter is being read, it means we have passed away, and our son Greg has attempted to seize control of the assets we left behind. We are writing this with clear minds and heavy hearts to finally confess our own profound cowardice." I felt hot tears begin to prick the corners of my eyes. I had not heard my parents speak with such honest clarity in years. The judge continued reading. "For 7 years, we have been the victims of relentless emotional extortion and financial manipulation at the hands of our son, Greg. He demanded hundreds of thousands of dollars from our retirement accounts to fund his failing vanity businesses and his lavish personal lifestyle. Whenever we hesitated to pay him, he threatened to cut us completely out of his life. He threatened to ensure we would never see our future grandchildren. We were terrified of dying alone and forgotten by our golden child. We were weak, and we allowed his aggressive bullying to drain our wealth. But our greatest sin was not our weakness," the judge read, pausing to look up at the gallery. Our greatest and most unforgivable sin was what we did to our daughter Clara. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I pressed my hands flat against the table to steady myself. We watched Clara give up her beloved teaching career to care for us. The judge read her voice softening slightly. We watched her drain her own modest savings to buy the medications we claimed we could not afford. We watched her lose sleep and sacrifice her youth to keep us comfortable in our own home. We let her believe we were financially ruined because we were too ashamed to admit that we were quietly funneling our remaining wealth to a son who refused to even visit us. Clara acted with pure and unconditional love, while Greg acted with absolute greed. We failed to protect the only child who truly loved us, and for that, we are eternally sorry. In the back of the courtroom, I heard someone begin to weep softly. I turned my head slightly and saw Aunt Susan holding a tissue to her face. Pastor Miller was staring at the floor with his head bowed in deep shame. The entire gallery was listening to the absolute, undeniable truth of my long and agonizing sacrifice. The smear campaign was officially dead. The judge raised her voice, allowing the formal authority of the court to fill the large room. Now, the legal directives of the codicil apply. We, Thomas and Catherine Hayes, being of sound mind, do hereby formally and completely disinherit our son, Greg Hayes. He is to receive absolutely nothing from this estate. We cite documented financial elder abuse manipulation and severe emotional extortion as the sole causes for this complete disinheritance. Greg let out a strangled gasp. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cold wood of the plaintiff's table. His perfect, expensive suit was wrinkled and ruined. Furthermore, the judge continued reading the sharp legal text. We name our daughter Clara Hayes as the sole and absolute beneficiary of our entire remaining estate. The family home, the remaining investment accounts, and all personal property are to be transferred to her immediately upon our passing. She has earned this legacy 100 times over with her own blood and sweat. A massive wave of relief washed over my tired body. The terrifying threat of the county tax foreclosure completely evaporated. My childhood home was safe. My future was secure. I had survived the nightmare. I thought the reading was over. I thought justice had finally been fully served. But Harrison Cole was not a man who settled for simple victories. He had helped my parents draft a document designed for total and absolute destruction. There is one final clause, the judge announced. Her eyes locked onto Greg like a predator finding its target. This final directive is legally binding upon the executor of the estate. The estate of Thomas and Catherine Hayes is hereby strictly and legally mandated to initiate immediate civil litigation against Greg Hayes and his associated limited liability companies. The executor must actively sue Greg Hayes for the full return of the $330,000 he extorted from us under duress. The massive steel trap finally sprang shut with a sound that seemed to shatter the very air in the courtroom. Greg's head snapped up. His face was a mask of absolute and unadulterated horror. He began to hyperventilate. His chest heaved as he frantically tried to draw oxygen into his lungs. He grabbed his expensive silk tie and ripped it loose from his collar, gasping for air. He finally realized the catastrophic and irreversible mistake he had made. Greg thought he was filing a simple civil lawsuit to intimidate his exhausted sister and steal a cheap inheritance. He thought he was the smartest and most powerful man in the room. But by filing that aggressive lawsuit, he had voluntarily trapped himself in the binding jurisdiction of the county probate court. He had arrogantly opened the door to the legal discovery process. He had literally handed Harrison Cole the absolute right to subpoena his private corporate bank accounts. He had willingly sat in a deposition and committed documented felony perjury on the official court record. He had done all of this under the delusion that he held all the power. Instead, he had just legally and permanently proven his own massive financial fraud in front of a sitting judge. He had just triggered a massive and inescapable financial judgment against himself. "You set me up," Greg screamed. He pointed a trembling finger at Harrison Cole. His voice was shrill and desperate and completely broken. "You planned this. You let me sue her just so you could pull my financial records." Harrison Cole did not even blink. He looked at my brother with a cold and terrifying smile. "I did not force you to file a fraudulent lawsuit, Mr. Hayes. I did not force you to commit perjury. And I certainly did not force you to steal from your dying parents. You dug your own grave. I simply handed you the shovel." Greg turned frantically to his expensive lead attorney. "Do something," he begged. "File an appeal. Object to the letter. Do your job and fix this right now." The gray-suited lawyer slowly closed the brass latches on his leather briefcase. He looked at Greg with pure professional disgust. He realized his wealthy client had lied to him from the very beginning and had just humiliated his law firm in open court. "I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel, Mr. Hayes," the lawyer said coldly. His voice carried across the silent room. "You lied about the underlying facts of this case. You committed perjury in my presence. I will not represent a client who engages in documented financial elder abuse. I highly suggest you retain a criminal defense attorney immediately." The lawyer picked up his briefcase and walked straight down the center aisle, pushing through the heavy wooden doors and leaving my brother completely alone at the plaintiff's table. In the gallery, Brittany stood up abruptly. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking. She looked at her husband, the man who had promised her endless wealth and luxury swimming pools and designer cars. She saw a man who was about to be entirely bankrupt and facing severe civil and criminal penalties. Brittany did not say a single word. She turned her back on Greg and walked out of the courtroom, leaving him completely abandoned. The judge slammed her heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed through the room, signaling the absolute end of the battle. "This court rules entirely in favor of the defense," the judge declared, her voice ringing with finality. "The fraudulent lawsuit filed by the plaintiff is dismissed with extreme prejudice. The final codicil of the Hayes Family Trust is recognized as valid and binding. Clara Hayes is hereby recognized as the sole beneficiary and executor of the estate." The judge leaned forward and stared directly into Greg's panicked and sweating face. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone dripping with judicial fury, "you walked into my courtroom attempting to use the legal system as a weapon to steal an inheritance from the sister who sacrificed her entire life to care for your parents. Instead, you have just provided this court with a complete sworn and documented confession of your own massive financial fraud. Your assets will be frozen by the end of business today. You will repay this estate every single dollar you stole." The judge struck her gavel one final time. "Court is adjourned." I sat at the dark wooden defense table and felt a deep and overwhelming peace wash over my tired soul. The suffocating weight of the past 3 years completely lifted from my shoulders. The terror of the foreclosure notice was gone. The social isolation and the cruel church rumors were entirely destroyed by the absolute truth. I looked across the aisle at my brother. Greg was sitting alone at the large table with his head buried in his hands. He was crying loudly. It was not the performative and calculated sorrow he had displayed at the funeral reception. It was the raw and pathetic weeping of an arrogant man who had finally met the catastrophic consequences of his own boundless greed. Harrison Cole gently placed his hand on my shoulder. "We won, Clara," he said softly. "It is finally over. You can go home now." I stood up slowly and smoothed the fabric of my simple gray cardigan. I did not walk over to my brother to offer forgiveness or sympathy. He did not deserve it, and I no longer had any obligation to provide it. I simply turned my back on the man who had tried to destroy me, and I walked out of the courtroom ready to begin the rest of my life. The sharp crack of the judge's wooden gavel echoing through the probate courtroom was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of absolute and undeniable justice. When you spend 3 agonizing years being told you are nothing but a burden and a scapegoat, you start to believe that the world will always be fundamentally unfair. But standing in that mahogany courtroom, watching my arrogant brother completely collapse under the crushing weight of his own documented lies, I realized that the truth always keeps an exact receipt. Because Greg had arrogantly chosen to lie under oath during his pre-trial deposition, and because Harrison Cole had presented a bulletproof financial timeline proving severe elder abuse, the judge showed absolutely zero mercy. She looked down from her elevated bench with a look of pure judicial disgust, and delivered a ruling that completely dismantled my brother's entire existence. The legal consequences were swift and entirely devastating. The court immediately ordered a complete freeze on all of Greg's personal and corporate assets. He was legally barred from touching a single dime of the money he had stolen. The judge formally instructed the estate to liquidate everything he owned to repay the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had systematically siphoned from our parents' retirement accounts. I heard the detailed specifics of his spectacular downfall in pieces over the next few months through Harrison Cole and distant family gossip. Greg's massive luxury mansion in Arizona, the beautiful desert estate that was secretly funded by my parents, while I was desperately trying to afford my mother's heart medication, was thrown into immediate foreclosure. The bank seized the property to satisfy the massive legal judgments against him. He was forced to pack his expensive designer suits into cheap cardboard boxes and vacate the premises under the supervision of local authorities. But the absolute poetic justice of the situation was how his wife Brittany reacted. Brittany was the woman who had mocked me on the phone from her exclusive golf resort, calling me an unemployed spinster who just played nurse for a paycheck. She had built her entire identity around country club memberships and luxury cars. The very afternoon that court-appointed agents arrived in Scottsdale to formally repossess her designer luxury SUV, Brittany filed for divorce. She did not stand by the man she had sworn to love, for better or for worse. The absolute second the money vanished and the public humiliation set in, she packed her expensive bags and left him entirely alone. Greg was left completely bankrupt and entirely socially exiled. The wealthy corporate friends he constantly bragged about stopped returning his frantic phone calls. The investment partners he had tried to impress wanted absolutely nothing to do with a man who had committed documented financial fraud against his own dying parents. He was left with no mansion, no luxury cars, no wife, and absolutely no reputation. He had to move into a cheap and cramped rental apartment on the outskirts of the city, working a low-level entry job just to pay his mounting legal fees. He had tried to bury me alive to steal an inheritance, but he had only succeeded in digging his own permanent financial grave. As for me, the very first thing I did after the trial concluded was drive back to my parents' suburban Ohio house. I walked through the heavy front door, but the air inside felt entirely different. It no longer felt like a suffocating hospital or a terrifying prison. It was just a house made of wood and drywall. The heavy ghosts of the past 3 years had finally been cleared away by the brilliant light of the truth. I spent 2 weeks meticulously packing up my few personal belongings and clearing out the decades of family memories. I donated the medical equipment to a local charity. I hired a real estate agent and listed the property on the market. Because the house was in a highly desirable neighborhood, it sold in less than 3 weeks for well over the asking price. When the final estate settlement cleared and the recovered funds from Greg's liquidated assets were officially transferred into my secure bank account, I looked at the massive digital number on my phone screen and I simply exhaled. I cried, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of absolute and profound relief. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely and entirely debt-free. I had sacrificed my teaching pension and drained my life savings to do the honorable thing, and now the universe had finally paid me back with interest. I knew I could not stay in Ohio. The neighborhood carried entirely too many heavy memories, and the judgmental church community that had so easily believed Greg's vicious smear campaign was not a place where I wanted to build my future. I packed my reliable 10-year-old sedan, and I drove south. I wanted bright sunlight. I wanted warmth. I wanted a place where absolutely nobody knew my name or my traumatic history. I moved to a beautiful and vibrant city in North Carolina. I used a portion of my recovered funds to buy a stunning modern townhouse right in the heart of a historic neighborhood lined with massive oak trees. It is completely different from the dark and sterile house I was trapped in for so long. My new home has massive floor-to-ceiling windows that let the bright morning sunlight pour into the kitchen. There are no medical monitors beeping in the corner. There are no heavy oxygen tanks taking up space in my living room. There is only peace, quiet, and absolute freedom. The deed to this beautiful townhouse is entirely in my name, and the only person who holds a key to the front door is me. I also reclaimed my professional life, but I did it entirely on my own terms. I did not return to the exhausting grind of the public school system. Instead, I used my background in history and education to launch my own freelance educational consulting and copywriting business. I set my own hours. I choose my own clients. If I want to take a random Tuesday afternoon off to walk through the local botanical gardens or sit in a cafe and read a book for pleasure, I simply do it. I answer to nobody but myself. The physical and emotional toll of being a full-time caregiver and then fighting a vicious legal battle took a very long time to heal. There were mornings when I would wake up in my beautiful new bedroom and experience a brief and terrifying spike of panic, thinking I had forgotten to administer my father's morning insulin or that I was late paying the county property taxes. But those moments of panic grew shorter and much less frequent with every passing month. They were slowly replaced by a profound and deep appreciation for the simple and mundane joys of a normal life. I joined a local book club. I started taking pottery classes on the weekends. I built a new circle of supportive friends who love me for exactly who I am not, for what I can sacrifice for them. If you are watching this video right now and you have stayed with me through this entire long and agonizing journey, I want to speak directly to your heart. I know that many of you watching are in your 50s, 60s, and beyond. I know that many of you were raised in a generation that constantly preached that family is the absolute most important thing in the world, and that you must always sacrifice your own needs to keep the peace and maintain the image of a perfect home. But I'm here to tell you that love isn't a transaction. Love is not a reward for being constantly useful, and no amount of money, time, or energy can buy something that should have been freely given from the start. If you are the person in your family who is always expected to give up your time, your money, and your emotional well-being to support a golden child who never lifts a single finger to help you need to wake up and see the absolute truth. You cannot buy loyalty from people who only view you as an unpaid employee or a convenient bank account. We are often taught that we must endure endless abuse just because we share DNA with someone. But the truth is that boundaries aren't betrayal. Saying no isn't selfish. If someone demands that you sacrifice your entire future, your financial stability, and your mental health to fund their reckless and entitled lifestyle, believe them the very first time they show you who they are. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm. You are not a bad daughter, a bad sister, or a bad person for finally standing up and saying that you have had enough of the lies and the financial abuse. You must remember that family isn't blood. Family isn't obligation. True family consists of the people who actually show up for you, who respect your boundaries, and who never ask you to destroy yourself for their comfort. If the people who raised you or grew up beside you call your self-respect a betrayal, then they never truly deserved your loyalty in the first place. You are not the villain in this story. You never were. You are simply someone who finally learned how to survive and fight back against the people who wanted to keep you small. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. Sharing this was incredibly difficult, but I know there is someone out there right now, sitting in a quiet room, exhausted and completely drained by an entitled family who desperately needed to hear this. If my story resonated with you, if it gave you even a tiny spark of courage to finally stand up for yourself and demand the respect you deserve, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps these stories reach the people who need them the absolute most. I want to hear from you now. Have you ever been the designated scapegoat in your family? Have you ever discovered a massive betrayal hiding in plain sight and had to fight your way out? Please drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and this community is a safe and welcoming place to share your truth. Also, please let me know where you are watching from today and what time it is in your part of the world. It brings me so much joy to connect with all of you across the globe. Until next time, please remember your incredible worth. Guard your heart, protect your peace, and take care of yourself. You have earned every single ounce of happiness coming your way. You truly deserve it.